Sometimes the most innocent voices speak the deepest truths. Sometimes it takes a child to show grown folks what real family looks like. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, a small homeless girl sits crying on the steps of the general store while everyone walks past. Mountain man Jacob Stone watches from across the street, his heart heavy with memories of his own hard childhood. His 8-year-old son Tommy tugs his sleeve and points at the girl. "Pa, that's going to be my sister," he says with simple certainty. The townspeople think Jacob is foolish for taking in a stranger's child. They whisper that he's asking for trouble, but Jacob knows something they don't. That family isn't always about blood, and sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the hardest choices. This is the story of how one act of kindness changed an entire community and proved that love can grow in the most unlikely places. But will their new family survive the judgment and cruelty of those who refuse to understand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried a sharp bite through the streets of Cedar Ridge, whistling between the weathered storefronts and stirring the dust that seemed to settle on everything in this corner of the Montana Territory. It was October 1884, and the town bore the hard edges of a place where survival mattered more than sentiment. Jacob Stone pulled his wool coat tighter as he walked beside his son Tommy, their boots echoing against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Jacob was a man carved by experience, his face weathered like the mountains that surrounded their small community. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned early that life gave you only what you could take from it. His hands, scarred from years of logging work in the high country, showed the calluses of honest labor. But it was his eyes that told the deeper story. They held the patient sadness of a man who had loved deeply and lost much. Tommy skipped beside him, all energy and enthusiasm despite the cold morning air. The boy had inherited his mother's bright spirit, though he carried his father's steady determination in the set of his small shoulders. At 8 years old, Tommy Stone had already learned more about loss than most children his age. But somehow that knowledge had made him more compassionate rather than harder. "Pa, why is everyone walking so fast today?" Tommy asked, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Jacob glanced around at the hurried pace of the townspeople, noting the way they kept their heads down and their conversations brief. "Winter's coming, son. Folks are getting ready." But that wasn't the whole truth, and Jacob knew it. Cedar Ridge had always been a difficult place, but lately there was something different in the air, a tension that went beyond the usual concerns about harsh weather and dwindling supplies. People seemed more suspicious, more quick to judge, as if the hardships of frontier life had finally worn away the last of their patience for anything that didn't directly benefit their own survival. They passed Murphy's saloon, where even at this early hour a few men sat nursing whiskey and bitter complaints. Jacob nodded to them politely, but their response was cool. He'd noticed the change over the past months, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the way some of the town council members looked at him with barely concealed disapproval. "Morning." "Jacob," called out Mrs. Patterson from behind the counter of the general store. Her voice carried its usual warmth, but Jacob detected something else there too, a note of concern that hadn't been there before. Eleanor Patterson was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who still remembered what kindness looked like. A widow herself, she ran the general store with firm efficiency and a surprisingly generous heart. She'd been Sarah's friend back when Sarah was alive, and had shown nothing but gentle support for Jacob and Tommy in the 2 years since the fever took his wife. "Morning." "Mrs. Patterson," Jacob replied, removing his hat as he entered the store. The familiar smells of coffee, tobacco, and dry goods brought back memories of better times, when he and Sarah would come to town together, planning their future and dreaming of the family they hoped to raise. Tommy immediately wandered toward the penny candy, his eyes wide with the eternal optimism of childhood. Jacob watched him with a mixture of love and worry. The boy had been asking questions lately, Questions about why they lived so far up the mountain, why they didn't come to town more often, why some of the other children weren't allowed to play with him. "How's the logging work, Jacob?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she measured out the flour he'd requested. "Good enough," he replied. "Mr. Henderson says there's steady work through the winter if the weather holds." Mrs. Patterson nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "You know, Jacob, there's been talk." The words hung between them like a warning. Jacob felt his shoulders tense, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "What kind of talk?" "Oh, you know how people get when times are hard," she said carefully, not meeting his eyes. "Some folks think, well, they think maybe it's time you considered finding Tommy a proper mother. A woman's influence, you understand." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd heard whispers before. Suggestions that a single man couldn't properly raise a child, that Tommy needed more than his father could provide. The talk had started shortly after Sarah's death and had never fully stopped, but lately it seemed to be gaining momentum. "Tommy's doing just fine," Jacob said quietly. "He's learning his letters, he helps with the work, and he's got more heart than most grown men in this town." "Oh, I know that, dear," Mrs. Patterson said quickly. "Anyone with eyes can see what a good boy he is. It's just—" She glanced around the store, then leaned closer. "Marcus Whitfield was in here yesterday. He had some strong opinions about the way certain folks are raising their children." The mention of Marcus Whitfield made Jacob's blood run cold. Whitfield was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a town boss, a man who'd arrived 5 years ago with money and connections, quickly establishing himself as the head of the unofficial town council. He owned the largest ranch in the area, employed 12 men, and had the ear of the territorial government. More importantly, he had opinions about how things should be done, and the influence to make those opinions stick. "What did he say?" Jacob asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Mrs. Patterson glanced toward Tommy, who was still examining the candy display with serious concentration. "He thinks there are too many people in this town who don't understand the importance of, well, of proper Christian values and community standards." The words were carefully chosen, but Jacob understood the message. Marcus Whitfield disapproved of single fathers, of men who lived too far from town, of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of respectability. And in a place like Cedar Ridge, Marcus Whitfield's disapproval could make life very difficult. "I see," Jacob said. He paid for his supplies, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite the anger building in his chest. Tommy bounded over with a piece of peppermint stick, his face bright with simple joy. "Look, Pa, Mrs. Patterson gave me candy." "What do you say, son?" "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." Tommy beamed at the older woman, who smiled despite her worried expression. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson touched Jacob's arm gently. "You're a good father, Jacob. Don't let anyone tell you different." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks. Jacob loaded their supplies into the wagon, his mind churning with worry. Tommy climbed up beside him, chattering about the various wonders he'd seen in the store, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of adult concern. They were just preparing to head home when Jacob noticed the commotion near the steps of the general store. A small crowd had gathered, but not the kind of crowd that forms around something pleasant. This was the uncomfortable cluster of people who were trying to look concerned while doing absolutely nothing to help. "What's happening, Pa?" Tommy asked, craning his neck to see. Jacob looked more carefully and felt his heart clench. There, huddled on the wooden steps, was a child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She was thin to the point of being gaunt, her clothes little more than rags, and she was crying with the exhausted desperation of someone who had reached the end of all hope. The townspeople stood around her like she was some kind of curiosity, talking about her as if she couldn't hear every word. Jacob caught fragments of their conversation, each comment harder than the last. "Been there since yesterday. Don't know where she came from. Probably diseased. Someone should do something." But nobody was doing anything. They were content to stand and stare and make their judgments from a safe distance. Jacob felt something twist in his chest. a familiar pain that reminded him of his own childhood, those years before his parents died, when he'd learned what it felt like to be hungry, cold, and completely alone in a world that seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone who didn't have the strength to fight back. "Pa," Tommy said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Jacob look down at his son. Tommy was staring at the little girl with an expression of pure compassion, his young face serious in a way that made him look far older than his 8 years. For a long moment, father and son watched as the girl shivered on the steps, ignored by the very people who should have been offering help. Then Tommy tugged on Jacob's sleeve and pointed directly at the girl with the unwavering certainty that only children possess. "Pa," he said with simple conviction, "that's going to be my sister." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He looked at his son, then at the girl, then at the crowd of adults who were slowly dispersing now that the novelty had worn off. In Tommy's eyes, Jacob saw something that had been missing from Cedar Ridge for far too long, the kind of immediate, uncomplicated love that didn't stop to calculate the cost or worry about what other people might think. Jacob Stone had learned many hard lessons in his 35 years. He'd learned that life could be cruel and unfair, that good people died too young, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant facing consequences you weren't prepared for. But he'd also learned something else, something his wife Sarah had taught him in the quiet moments they'd shared, that love wasn't just a feeling but a choice, and that the measure of a man wasn't what he had, but what he was willing to give. Standing there in the cold autumn wind, watching his son point at a stranger's child with absolute certainty that she belonged with them, Jacob Stone made a choice that would change all their lives forever. He climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the little girl, ignoring the curious stares of the remaining townspeople. She looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young, eyes that reminded him painfully of his own childhood. "Hello there," he said gently, crouching down so he was at her level. "What's your name?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, clearly unsure whether this was another adult who would eventually walk away. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Grace, that's a pretty name," Jacob said. "I'm Jacob Stone, and this is my son Tommy. We live up in the mountains, and we were wondering—" He paused, aware that the next words would commit him to a path he couldn't take back. "We were wondering if you might like to come home with us for a hot meal and a warm place to sleep." Grace looked at him with the wariness of a wild animal, hope and fear warring in her expression. "Really? Really?" Jacob said, and meant it completely. Behind him he heard Tommy scramble down from the wagon. "See, Pa? I told you she was gonna be my sister." As Jacob helped Grace to her feet, he was aware of the weight of watching eyes, of the whispered conversations that would follow them all the way home and beyond. He thought of Marcus Whitfield and his opinions about proper Christian values, of Mrs. Patterson's worried warnings. Of all the reasons, this was probably a mistake. Then he looked at Tommy's beaming face and Grace's tentative smile, and he knew that sometimes the biggest mistakes were actually the most important choices you'd ever make. The wind continued to blow down from the mountains as they loaded Grace into the wagon. But somehow it didn't feel quite as cold anymore. The wagon ride up the mountain to Jacob's cabin passed mostly in silence, broken only by Tommy's gentle attempts to make Grace feel welcome and the creaking of wheels over rocky terrain. Grace sat between them, clutching a small bundle that seemed to contain everything she owned in the world, which, as far as Jacob could tell, wasn't much more than a torn piece of cloth wrapped around something precious. As they climbed higher, leaving the dust and judgment of Cedar Ridge behind, Jacob found himself stealing glances at the child they'd just taken in. Grace appeared to be about 7, though malnourishment might have made her seem younger than her actual age. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face that would have been pretty if not for the hollow cheeks and shadows under her eyes. But it was those eyes themselves that haunted Jacob. They held a depth of sorrow no child should carry. "Are you really going to be my sister?" Tommy asked with the straightforward curiosity of childhood. Grace looked at him uncertainly, then at Jacob. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I don't know how that works." Tommy considered this seriously. "Well, I think you just decide. Like I decided you were going to be my sister, and Pa decided to bring you home, so now you are. That's how families work, right, Pa?" Jacob felt his throat tighten at his son's simple wisdom. "Something like that, son." The cabin came into view as they rounded the last bend in the narrow mountain road. It wasn't much, a modest log structure with a stone chimney, a small barn, and a vegetable garden that had already been harvested for winter, but it was solid and warm, built with Jacob's own hands during the early years of his marriage to Sarah. Grace stared at the cabin with an expression Jacob couldn't quite read. "It's very nice," she said politely, the kind of automatic response that suggested she'd learned early how to be grateful for any kindness, no matter how small. "Come on," Tommy said, jumping down from the wagon with his usual energy. "I'll show you everything." But as Grace tried to follow, her legs gave out beneath her. Jacob caught her just as she would have fallen, feeling how light she was, how her small body trembled with exhaustion and hunger. Her eyes rolled back, and for a terrifying moment Jacob thought she might be dying right there in his arms. "Tommy, get inside and stoke the fire," Jacob commanded, his voice sharp with concern. "Then put water on to boil." Tommy's face went pale, but he nodded and ran toward the cabin without argument. Jacob carried Grace inside, noting how her breathing was shallow and rapid, how her skin felt clammy despite the cold mountain air. He laid her gently on Sarah's old rocking chair near the fireplace, the same chair where his wife had nursed Tommy as a baby, and where she'd spent her final weeks watching the mountains she'd loved so much. The irony wasn't lost on him. Another soul in need, finding comfort in the place where Sarah had given so much of herself. Tommy had the fire blazing and water heating by the time Jacob had Grace settled. The boy moved with surprising efficiency for his age, gathering blankets and hovering nearby with the anxious expression of someone who wanted desperately to help but didn't know what to do. "Is she gonna be okay, Pa?" Tommy whispered. "I think so, son. She's just hungry and tired. Sometimes, when folks have been without food for too long, their bodies need time to remember how to be strong again." Jacob prepared a simple broth from the beef bones he'd been saving, adding whatever vegetables he could find. As the smell filled the cabin, Grace's eyes fluttered open. She looked around in confusion, as if she'd forgotten where she was or how she'd gotten there. "Easy now," Jacob said gently. "You're safe. You just fainted from hunger, that's all." Grace struggled to sit up, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be trouble. I can go." "You're not going anywhere," Jacob said firmly. "Not until you've had something to eat and a good night's sleep." He helped her sip the warm broth, noting how her hands shook as she held the cup. Between small sips, she began to talk, fragments of her story emerging between grateful tears. Her name was Grace Hartwell. She'd been traveling with her parents in a wagon train heading for California when disaster struck. Her parents had died. She was vague about the details, but Jacob suspected disease or accident, and she'd been left with strangers who'd promised to look after her until they reached their destination. But somewhere along the trail, those strangers had decided that caring for an orphaned child was more responsibility than they'd bargained for. "They said they were sorry," Grace whispered, staring into her cup of broth. "They left me in a town 2 days back, said someone there would take care of me. But nobody wanted me, so I walked." Jacob felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger he'd felt as a child when adults had failed him, when people who should have protected the vulnerable instead chose the easier path of looking away. Grace had walked for 2 days through mountain terrain that would challenge grown men, driven by nothing but the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, someone might show her kindness. Tommy sat on the floor beside Grace's chair, his young face serious with concentration. "Where's your family now?" he asked. "Dead," Grace said simply, and the matter-of-fact way she said it broke Jacob's heart. "There's nobody left but me." "That's not true," Tommy said with sudden fierceness. "You got us now," Grace looked at him with wonder, as if the concept of belonging somewhere was too foreign to fully comprehend. "Really? Really?" Tommy said, then looked at his father for confirmation. "Right, Pa?" Jacob found himself at a crossroads that would define not just his own future, but the futures of both children, looking at him with such hope and trust. He thought of Sarah, of the conversations they'd had about the family they wanted to build, the values they wanted to pass on. He thought of his own lonely childhood and the adults who had failed him when he needed them most. But mostly, he thought about the way Tommy had pointed at Grace with such certainty, the way his son's young heart had recognized something that all the adults in Cedar Ridge had missed. That family wasn't about blood or convenience or social approval. It was about choosing to love someone when they needed it most. "Yes," Jacob said quietly. "That's right." Over the next few hours, as Grace slowly regained her strength, more details of her story emerged. Her parents had been educated people. Her father a school teacher, her mother a minister's daughter, who'd sold everything they owned for the chance to start fresh in California. Grace could read and write better than most adults in Cedar Ridge, a testament to parents who'd valued learning above material possessions. But it was what she carried in her small bundle that truly revealed the depth of her loss. Wrapped carefully in a piece of faded cloth was a simple rag doll, its face stitched with loving care, its dress sewn from scraps of what had once been a beautiful quilt. "Mama made her for me," Grace said, holding the doll protectively. "Her name is Hope. Mama said as long as I had hope with me, everything would be all right eventually." The doll was in terrible condition. One arm was nearly torn off. The stuffing was coming out in several places, and the once bright dress was faded and stained from their hard journey. But Grace held it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which Jacob realized it probably was. Tommy examined the doll with the serious attention he gave to all important matters. "She needs fixing," he announced. "Pa, can we fix her?" Jacob looked at the damaged toy, then at Grace's hopeful face. "I think we can manage something," he said. As the evening wore on, Jacob found himself watching Grace with growing amazement. Despite everything she'd been through, the loss of her parents, the abandonment by the people who'd promised to care for her, the 2 days of walking through dangerous territory, she maintained a quiet dignity that spoke to inner strength far beyond her years. She insisted on helping with supper preparations, despite Jacob's protests that she should rest. She thanked him repeatedly for every small kindness. And most remarkably, she seemed to understand instinctively that Tommy needed to feel important and useful. Asking for his help with tasks she could probably have managed alone. "Tommy," she said as they prepared for bed, "could you show me how to bank the fire like your pa does? I want to learn so I can help." Tommy's chest puffed with pride as he demonstrated the proper technique, explaining each step with the seriousness of a much older child. Grace listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that made Tommy feel like the expert he was pretending to be. Watching them together, Jacob felt something shift in his understanding of what his life might become. For 2 years, it had been just him and Tommy against the world, a small, complete unit that asked nothing from anyone else. But now, seeing his son's natural protectiveness toward Grace, seeing how her presence seemed to bring out the best in both of them, Jacob began to imagine a different kind of future. That night, as Grace slept on a makeshift bed near the fire, and Tommy whispered excitedly about all the things he wanted to show his new sister, Jacob sat by the window looking out at the star-filled sky. In his hands, he held Sarah's worn Bible, the leather binding smooth from years of handling, the pages marked with her careful notes and favorite passages. He opened to a verse Sarah had underlined in her neat handwriting. "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." Sarah's voice seemed to whisper from the pages, reminding him of conversations they'd had about the children they hoped to raise, the values they wanted to instill, the kind of home they wanted to create. She'd always believed that love was meant to be shared, that families grew not just through birth, but through choice and commitment and the simple decision to open your heart to someone who needed it. "What do you think, Sarah?" he whispered to the darkness. "Am I doing the right thing?" The only answer was the gentle sound of two children breathing peacefully by his fire. And somehow that was enough. But even as Jacob felt peace settling over their small family, he couldn't shake the memory of the looks they'd received in town, the disapproval, the whispered conversations, the way people had stared at Grace like she was some kind of threat to their carefully ordered world. Tomorrow, he would need to face the practical realities of his decision. There would be legal questions about custody and guardianship. There would be social pressure from people like Marcus Whitfield, who believed they knew better than Jacob what was good for his family. There would be challenges he couldn't even imagine yet. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Jacob Stone's cabin felt truly complete. The sound of Grace's gentle breathing mixed with Tommy's familiar sleep sounds, and in that harmony, Jacob heard the beginning of something beautiful and right and worth fighting for. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of winter and the certainty of harder days to come. But inside the cabin, 3 hearts beat in the rhythm of a family that had chosen each other, and for now, that was enough to keep the cold at bay. The first week with Grace brought changes that Jacob hadn't anticipated. The child who had collapsed from exhaustion and hunger gradually revealed herself to be remarkably resilient and surprisingly capable. By the 3rd morning, she was awake before dawn, quietly stoking the fire and attempting to prepare breakfast without waking Jacob or Tommy. "You don't need to do that," Jacob told her gently, as he found her carefully turning flapjacks on the griddle. "You're not a servant here, Grace. You're family." The word seemed to catch her off guard every time he used it. She would pause in whatever she was doing, her eyes growing wide with something that looked like wonder mixed with disbelief, as if the concept of belonging somewhere was still too foreign to fully accept. "I want to help," she said quietly. "I want to earn my keep." "You don't need to earn anything," Jacob replied, but he could see that she needed to feel useful, needed to contribute in whatever way she could. It was a pride he recognized from his own difficult childhood, the desperate desire to prove that you deserved whatever kindness was being shown to you. Tommy had no such complicated feelings about Grace's presence. To him, having a sister was the most natural thing in the world, and he threw himself into the role of protector and teacher with enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed their new family member. "Come on, Grace. Let me show you the best place to find wild berries," he would call, racing ahead up the mountain paths with boundless energy. Grace would follow more carefully, her city-bred parents having left her unprepared for wilderness life. But she was a quick learner. Within days, she could identify edible plants, help with basic woodcraft, and navigate the trails around their cabin with growing confidence. It was during one of these explorations that Tommy made a discovery that would change everything. They were returning from checking the rabbit snares when he spotted something glinting in the sunlight near a fallen log. "Pa, look what I found," Tommy called out, running toward Jacob with his hands cupped carefully around something small and bright. Jacob's breath caught as he saw what his son held, a simple gold wedding band, tarnished with age but unmistakably valuable. For a moment, Jacob's heart clenched with the wild hope that somehow, impossibly, it might be Sarah's ring, lost during one of their walks together. But as he examined it more closely, he realized it was different, smaller, with a delicate engraving around the band. "Where exactly did you find this, son?" Jacob asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Tommy led them back to the fallen log, chattering excitedly about how the ring had been hiding under some leaves. Grace followed quietly, but Jacob noticed how her face had gone pale when she saw the ring. "Grace," Jacob said gently, "do you recognize this?" For a moment he thought she might deny it. Then her composure crumbled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "It was Mama's," she whispered. "I must have dropped it somewhere. I've been carrying it in my pocket since she died. It's all I have left of her." Jacob felt his heart break a little more for this child who had already lost so much. Without hesitation, he knelt down and gently placed the ring in Grace's small hands. "Then it belongs with you," he said simply. Grace stared at the ring through her tears, then looked up at Jacob with an expression of such gratitude that it made his chest tight with emotion. "But it's worth money," she said. "You could sell it. I know I'm expensive to keep, with the food and—" "Grace Elena Hartwell," Jacob said, using the full name she'd told him during one of their evening conversations. "You are not expensive. You are priceless. And this ring stays with you where it belongs." That night, as Grace carefully cleaned her mother's ring and slipped it onto the chain that held her father's pocket watch, another precious keepsake she'd managed to save, Jacob found himself thinking about Sarah's own wedding ring, tucked away in the small wooden box where he kept his most treasured memories. Sarah had been very clear about what should happen to her ring when she died. "Oh, when you find someone else to love," she'd whispered during those final difficult days, "I want you to give her my ring. Not because she's replacing me, but because love should continue, Jacob. It should grow and spread and make the world a little less lonely." At the time, Jacob had been unable to imagine loving anyone else, unable to conceive of a future that didn't center entirely around grief and the business of simply surviving each day. But now, watching Grace carefully tend to the small treasures that connected her to her lost parents, he began to understand what Sarah had been trying to tell him. Love wasn't a finite resource that diminished when shared. It was something that grew stronger when given away. Something that created connections and built families and transformed strangers into the most important people in your world. The next morning brought their first real test as a family. Sheriff Coleman rode up the mountain trail, his face grim with official business. Jacob watched him approach with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He'd been expecting this visit, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "Morning, Jacob," Coleman said, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. "Mind if we talk?" "Of course." "Coffee's hot." They sat on the porch while Grace and Tommy played nearby, both children pretending not to listen to the adult conversation that would determine their future. "You know why I'm here," Coleman said without preamble. He was a good man, Jacob knew, fair and decent, but he was also bound by law and the expectations of the community that employed him. "Someone's been asking questions about Grace," Jacob said. "It wasn't really a question. Marcus Whitfield came to see me yesterday. He's concerned about the legal implications of what you've done. Taking in a child without proper paperwork, without going through the territorial authorities. He says it could be considered kidnapping." Jacob's hand tightened around his coffee cup, but he kept his voice level. "That child was abandoned on the steps of the general store. Everyone in town saw her. Nobody else was willing to help." "I know that," Coleman said quietly. "Hell, Jacob, everyone knows that. But Whitfield's got connections in the territorial capital, and he's making noise about proper procedures and legal guardianship. He wants the girl turned over to the territorial orphanage while the authorities sort things out." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He'd heard about the territorial orphanage, a grim institution where children were treated more like prisoners than young people deserving of care and protection. The thought of Grace in such a place made him feel sick. "She belongs here," Jacob said firmly. "She belongs with us." "I believe you," Coleman replied. "But believing something and being able to legally protect it are two different things. Whitfield's demanding I investigate your fitness as a guardian. He's questioning whether a single man living this far from town can properly care for two children." Jacob looked over at Grace and Tommy, who had abandoned any pretense of playing and were now openly listening to the conversation. Grace's face was pale, with the kind of fear that spoke to hard experience with adult decisions that could rip her world apart without warning. "What do you need from me, Sheriff?" Jacob asked. "Honestly, I need you to go through the proper channels. File the paperwork for legal guardianship. Get character references from respectable members of the community. Show that you can provide for both children financially and morally." Coleman paused, his expression troubled. And Jacob, you need to know that Whitfield's going to fight you every step of the way. He's convinced that what you're doing is somehow wrong, somehow dangerous to the community's moral standards. After Coleman left, Jacob sat on his porch steps, staring out at the mountains that had always been his refuge from the complications of dealing with other people. Grace approached hesitantly, Tommy close behind her. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked at both children, at Tommy's fierce determination and Grace's frightened hope, and made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. "No," he said firmly. "They are not. We're a family now, and families stick together." That evening, Jacob opened Sarah's wooden memory box for the first time since her funeral. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had symbolized their love and commitment for 10 years of marriage. He held the ring up to the lamplight, remembering the day he'd slipped it onto Sarah's finger, the promises they'd made to each other, the future they'd planned to build together. Then he looked at Grace, who was carefully mending her torn doll with thread and patience that spoke to inner strength far beyond her years. "Grace," he said quietly, "come here for a moment." She set down her sewing and approached cautiously, probably expecting another difficult conversation about legal complications and uncertain futures. Instead, Jacob held out Sarah's ring. "This belonged to my wife," he said gently. "Before she died, she made me promise that when I found someone else to love, someone else to consider family, I would give this ring to them as a symbol that they belonged here, that they were chosen and wanted and precious." Grace stared at the ring with wide eyes. "But I'm just a little girl." "You're not just anything," Jacob replied. "You're my daughter, not by blood maybe, but by choice, by love, by the simple fact that you belong here with us. And nothing Marcus Whitfield or anyone else says is going to change that." He slipped the ring onto a chain, then fastened it around Grace's neck alongside her mother's ring and father's watch. "When you're older, if you choose, you can wear it on your finger. But for now, I want you to carry it close to your heart as a promise that you will always have a place here, that you will always be wanted, and that you will always be our Grace." Grace touched the ring through her nightgown, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Really? Even if people tried to take me away?" "Even then," Jacob said firmly. "We'll fight for you, Grace. We'll fight for our family." Tommy nodded solemnly, his young face set with determination that would have been comical if it hadn't been so sincere. "We sure will. Right, Pa?" "Right, son." That night, as Grace slept peacefully for the first time since arriving at their cabin, Jacob sat by his window planning the battle that he knew was coming. Marcus Whitfield was a powerful man with strong opinions about how things should be done. But Jacob had something Whitfield didn't understand: the absolute certainty that comes from knowing you're fighting for the most important thing in the world. Outside, winter was beginning its slow advance down from the high peaks. And somewhere in Cedar Ridge, forces were aligning against their small family. But inside the cabin, 3 hearts beat with the steady rhythm of people who had chosen each other. And that choice would prove stronger than all the opposition the world could muster. The real fight was just beginning. But Jacob Stone had never backed down from a fight that mattered. And nothing had ever mattered more than this. November brought the first real snow to the high country, and with it, a settling into routines that began to feel like the natural rhythm of family life. Grace had been with them for nearly a month, and the transformation in her was remarkable. The hollow-cheeked waif who had collapsed on their doorstep was becoming a confident, capable child who could chop kindling, help with cooking, and keep up with Tommy on their rambles through the mountain forests. But it was her mind that truly amazed Jacob. During the long winter evenings by the fire, as he worked with both children on their letters and numbers, Grace revealed an intelligence that had been carefully nurtured by educated parents. She could not only read and write with remarkable skill for her age, but she showed an artistic talent that delighted Tommy and impressed Jacob. "Look, Pa!" Tommy called out one morning, rushing to show Jacob a drawing Grace had made. "She drew our cabin, but it's perfect." It looks just like looking out the window. Jacob examined the sketch, done with nothing but a piece of charcoal on the back of an old paper sack, and felt his breath catch. Grace had captured not just the physical details of their home, but something deeper, the sense of warmth and belonging that made it more than just a building in the wilderness. "This is beautiful, Grace," he said, meaning it completely. "Where did you learn to draw like this?" Grace ducked her head shyly. "Mama taught me." She said drawing was a way of holding on to things that might go away. The simple statement hit Jacob with unexpected force. This child, who had lost everything, was using her art to capture and preserve the new life they were building together, as if she understood, even at 7 years old, how precious and fragile happiness could be. "Well, I think we need to get you some proper drawing materials," Jacob said. "Next time we go to town, we'll see what Mrs. Patterson has in the way of paper and pencils." The mention of town brought a shadow to Grace's face, a reminder that the outside world was still full of complications and challenges. Over the past weeks, Jacob had been working on the legal paperwork for guardianship, but progress was slow and frustrating. Every form seemed to require references from people who barely knew him. Proof of income that was difficult to document for someone who made his living from seasonal logging work, and character testimonials from respectable members of the community, most of whom seemed to view his decision to take in Grace with suspicion rather than approval. The problem came to a head during their next trip to Cedar Ridge for supplies. Jacob had hoped to make it a pleasant outing, Grace's first real chance to see the town as part of their family, rather than as a frightened, abandoned child. He'd even carved a small wooden toy for her, a horse that Tommy had painted with bright colors, using dyes made from berries and clay. Tommy clutched his own treasure, a hand-carved wooden horse that had been his constant companion since his mother's death. It was simple work, the kind of toy a loving father makes for his son during long winter evenings, but to Tommy it was precious beyond measure. "Here, Grace," Tommy said as they loaded into the wagon. "You can play with him if you want. His name is Thunder, and he's the fastest horse in all of Montana." Grace accepted the toy with the reverence she showed to all gifts, understanding instinctively how much it meant to Tommy to share something so important. "Are you sure?" "What if I hurt him?" "You won't," Tommy said with confidence. "Besides, Thunder's been lonely. He needs a friend." It was this scene, Grace and Tommy sharing the wooden horse while laughing at some private joke, that greeted the people of Cedar Ridge as the Stone family arrived in town. For a moment, Jacob felt hope that perhaps the community might see what he saw. Two children who clearly belonged together, who brought out the best in each other, who had formed the kind of sibling bond that would last a lifetime. That hope died quickly. "Well, would you look at that?" came a voice from the steps of Murphy's saloon. Jacob Stone's playing house with his little stray. The words were spoken just loudly enough to be heard, just quietly enough to maintain plausible deniability. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral as he helped both children down from the wagon. More whispers followed them as they walked toward the general store, comments about proper procedures and what kind of example this sets, and poor Tommy being exposed to God knows what kind of influences. Grace's shoulders hunched as if she could make herself smaller, less noticeable, less of a target for disapproval. Tommy, however, had no intention of making himself smaller. When a group of children his own age approached them near the store, his posture straightened with defensive pride. "Is that really your sister?" asked Billy Murphy, the saloon-keeper's son, his tone suggesting that the very idea was somehow ridiculous. "Yes, she is," Tommy replied firmly. "But she's not really, though," pressed another child. "She's just some girl your pa found." Tommy's face flushed with anger. "She is too, my sister. She lives with us and everything, and she's smarter than all of you put together." "That's what my pa says, too," piped up Sarah Coleman, the sheriff's daughter. Her intervention surprised Jacob. Sheriff Coleman had been professionally supportive but cautious, and Jacob hadn't expected that support to extend to his family. "My pa says Mr. Stone's doing what's right," Sarah continued with the absolute conviction that only children possess. He says sometimes families aren't born, they're chosen. And he says anyone who has a problem with that maybe doesn't understand what being Christian really means. The comment effectively ended the confrontation, but Jacob could see how the exchange affected Grace, despite the support from Sarah Coleman. Despite Tommy's fierce loyalty, the undercurrent of disapproval in the community was wearing on her. She'd begun to hunch her shoulders when they were in public, to speak more quietly, to try to make herself invisible, behaviors that reminded Jacob painfully of his own childhood responses to adult judgment and rejection. Inside the general store, Mrs. Patterson greeted them with her usual warmth, but even she seemed more subdued than usual. As Jacob conducted his business, purchasing supplies and the drawing materials he'd promised Grace, he became aware of the conversations happening, in hushed tones around the store, not natural for a single man. What kind of influence is poor? Little Tommy heard. She might have been running from something. The last comment made Jacob's blood run cold. He'd been so focused on the legal challenges of adoption that he hadn't considered what stories might be circulating about Grace's past, what explanations people might be creating for why a child would be wandering alone in the wilderness. As they prepared to leave, Marcus Whitfield entered the store with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding attention and respect. He was an imposing figure, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of authoritative bearing that came from wealth and social position. Behind him trailed two other members of the town council, men who clearly looked to Whitfield for guidance on matters of community importance. "Jacob," Whitfield said with a nod that managed to be polite and dismissive at the same time. "I was hoping I'd run into you." "Marcus," Jacob replied carefully. He was aware of Grace and Tommy flanking him, of the way other customers had suddenly found reasons to linger near enough to overhear whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I understand you're having some difficulty with the guardianship paperwork," Whitfield said, his tone suggesting helpful concern rather than opposition. "Bureaucracy can be so complicated, can't it? Especially for someone without experience navigating these sorts of legal matters." Jacob felt the trap being set, but couldn't see a way to avoid it. "I'm working through the proper channels." Of course. "But I wonder if you've fully considered what's best for the child." Whitfield's gaze shifted to Grace, who instinctively moved closer to Jacob's side. "A girl her age needs certain influences, the guidance of proper women, the structure of formal education, the social connections that come from being part of an established community." "She has all of that," Jacob said quietly. "Does she? Living so far from town, with only you and young Tommy for company." Whitfield shook his head with theatrical sadness. "I'm not questioning your intentions, Jacob. I'm sure they're admirable. But intentions aren't enough when it comes to properly raising a child, especially a girl child." The conversation was attracting more attention now. Other customers openly listening to what was becoming a public debate about Grace's future. Jacob could feel the weight of all those watching eyes, could sense Grace's growing distress as she became the center of unwanted attention. "What exactly are you suggesting, Marcus?" Jacob asked. "I'm suggesting that perhaps there's a better solution. The territorial orphanage has excellent facilities, proper schooling, trained staff who understand the needs of displaced children. And there's a family in Denver, good Christian people, who've been looking to adopt a young girl. They could provide her with opportunities. Jacob, real opportunities for education and social advancement that she'll never have living in isolation up on your mountain." The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable and caring, but Jacob heard the threat underneath them. Whitfield wasn't just questioning Jacob's fitness as a guardian, he was actively working to remove Grace from their family. "She belongs with us," Jacob said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several people step back. "Does she?" Whitfield asked. "Or are you simply being selfish, keeping her with you because it makes you feel better about your own loneliness, regardless of what's actually best for her?" The accusation hit like a physical blow, especially because part of Jacob wondered if there might be truth to it. Was he being selfish? Was he denying Grace opportunities she might have elsewhere because he couldn't bear the thought of losing another person he'd come to love? Before Jacob could respond, Tommy stepped forward with the fearless determination that only children possess when defending something truly important to them. She doesn't want to go anywhere else. Tommy announced loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear. She wants to stay with us because we're her family. And families don't give up on each other just because other people don't understand. The simple declaration, delivered with such absolute conviction, seemed to silence the entire store. Even Whitfield appeared momentarily taken aback by the fierce loyalty of an 8-year-old boy defending his sister. Grace reached out and took Tommy's hand, her own voice quiet but clear as she spoke for the first time since entering the store. "Tommy's right," she said, looking directly at Whitfield, despite the fear Jacob could see in her eyes. "I want to stay with my family. They chose me, and I choose them too." In that moment, Jacob felt something shift in the store's atmosphere. Several customers nodded approval, their expressions softening as they witnessed the genuine bond between the children. Even Mrs. Patterson beamed with pride from behind her counter, but Whitfield's face hardened with something that looked like genuine anger. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said coldly. "Children shouldn't be making these kinds of decisions. They need proper adult guidance, not—" He gestured dismissively at Grace and Tommy's clasped hands. "Not sentimental nonsense about choosing families. It's sometimes sentimental nonsense is the most important thing there is," came a voice. From the back of the store, everyone turned to see Sheriff Coleman standing in the doorway, his expression thoughtful but determined. "Sometimes sentimental nonsense is the most important thing there is," he repeated, moving into the store with the quiet authority of his office. "And sometimes what looks like proper procedure is just another way of ignoring what's right in front of your eyes." Coleman's gaze swept the assembled crowd before settling on Whitfield. "I've been watching this family for weeks now, Marcus. I've seen how those children look after each other, how Jacob's teaching them both to be decent, capable people. I've seen Grace go from a scared, half-starved waif to a confident little girl who belongs somewhere. And I've seen Tommy step up to be the kind of big brother who'd fight the whole world to protect his sister." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Now, I don't know much about fancy theories of child-rearing, but I know something about families. And what I see here is a family that works, a family that chose each other and is making each other stronger because of it." Whitfield's face flushed with anger. "Sheriff, I hardly think you're qualified to—" "I'm qualified to recognize when someone's trying to break up a good thing for reasons that have nothing to do with what's best for the children involved." Coleman interrupted, his voice carrying a warning edge that made Whitfield step back. The tension in the store was thick enough to cut, but Jacob felt something loosen in his chest. Having the sheriff's public support wouldn't solve all their legal problems, but it meant they weren't completely alone in this fight. As they left the store, Grace walking between Jacob and Tommy with her head held higher than when they'd entered, Jacob reflected on how much had changed in just a few minutes. The community was clearly divided about their family, but at least now the divisions were out in the open where they could be addressed. That evening, as Grace carefully arranged her new drawing supplies and Tommy played with his wooden horse, Jacob sat down to write the most important letter of his life, a formal application for legal guardianship that would either secure their family's future or provide Whitfield with the ammunition he needed to tear them apart. But as he watched Grace sketch a picture of Tommy and his horse, both of them laughing at some shared joke, Jacob knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had become something greater than the sum of their individual parts. They had become a family in the truest sense of the word, bound not by blood, but by choice, love, and the simple recognition that they belonged together. Outside, the first major snowstorm of winter was beginning to build, and somewhere in town, Marcus Whitfield was probably planning his next move against them. But inside their warm cabin, 3 hearts beat with the steady rhythm of people who had found their place in the world. And that was a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. December settled over the mountains like a heavy quilt, bringing with it the kind of deep cold that turned breath to fog and made every step crunch with frozen snow. Inside the stone cabin, however, warmth prevailed in ways that had nothing to do with the blazing fireplace. 3 months had passed since Grace's arrival, and the rhythms of their daily life had evolved into something that felt as natural and permanent as the mountains themselves. Grace had not only recovered her physical strength, but had blossomed into a confident, capable member of their small family. Her intelligence continued to amaze Jacob. She had quickly surpassed Tommy in reading and arithmetic, despite being younger, and her artistic abilities grew more sophisticated with each passing day. The cabin walls were now decorated with her drawings, detailed sketches of mountain wildlife, portraits of Tommy in various states of mischief, and landscapes that captured the austere beauty of their high country home. But it was the newest addition that held the place of honor on the mantel, a carefully detailed drawing of the 3 of them standing together in front of their cabin, Jacob's arms around both children, all of them smiling with the genuine happiness of people who had found exactly where they belonged. Jacob had commissioned Mrs. Patterson's traveling photographer to create a formal tintype portrait based on Grace's drawing. The photographer, a stern man from Denver who specialized in family portraits, had initially been skeptical about the unusual family arrangement. But by the end of the session, even he had been charmed by the obvious affection between the 3 subjects. "Well, I'll be," he'd muttered as he packed up his equipment. "Don't think I've ever seen a more natural-looking family group, regardless of how they came together." Now that tintype sat in a place of honor on Jacob's dresser, the first family photograph that included Grace, tangible proof that she belonged here as much as any child born to them could have. Grace treasured it almost as much as her mother's ring, often stopping to trace the glass with her finger as if to reassure herself that the happiness it captured was real and permanent. But the photograph represented more than just sentimental value. It was Jacob's secret weapon in the legal battle that continued to rage around their family. Every document he filed, every character reference he submitted, every legal argument he made was accompanied by that photograph. Visual proof that whatever technical difficulties existed with the guardianship process, this was undeniably a real family bound by genuine love and mutual care. The legal process itself had become a grinding test of patience and determination. Jacob had spent countless hours traveling to the county seat, meeting with lawyers and clerks and territorial officials who seemed determined to make the simplest procedures as complicated as possible. Each form required additional documentation. Each meeting led to requests for more references, more proof of income, more evidence of his moral fitness to raise children. Some of the opposition was simply bureaucratic inefficiency. But Jacob had begun to suspect that Marcus Whitfield's influence extended farther than he'd initially realized. Clerks who had initially seemed helpful suddenly discovered new requirements. Officials who had appeared supportive began asking pointed questions about Jacob's qualifications as a single father. Forms that should have taken weeks to process seemed to disappear into administrative limbo for months at a time. But Jacob persisted, driven by the absolute certainty that his family was worth fighting for. And gradually he began to accumulate allies in unexpected places. Mrs. Patterson had written a character reference that was both glowing and specific, detailing her observations of Jacob's parenting skills and Grace's remarkable transformation under his care. Sheriff Coleman had submitted an official report stating that the Stone family posed no threat to community safety and that Jacob Stone was a man of exemplary character who has shown remarkable dedication to the welfare of children in need. More surprising had been the support from Dr. William Hayes, the circuit doctor who served the mountain communities. Hayes had initially come to examine Grace at Jacob's request, wanting to ensure that her difficult journey hadn't left her with any lasting health problems. But the doctor had stayed for dinner, charmed by Grace's intelligence and Tommy's irrepressible energy, and had left declaring that he'd rarely seen children who seemed more secure and well cared for. "What you've done here is remarkable, Jacob," Dr. Hayes had said as he prepared to continue his rounds. "That child has not only recovered physically from what must have been a terrible ordeal, but she's thriving in ways that suggest she feels completely secure and loved. Whatever the bureaucrats in the territorial capital might say about proper procedures, you've given her something that can't be quantified in legal documents. You've given her a home." Even more unexpected support had come from Father Miguel Santos, the traveling priest who served the scattered Catholic families in the region. Father Santos had arrived for one of his irregular visits to find Grace helping Tommy with his catechism lessons, both children working together with the kind of natural cooperation that spoke to deep mutual affection. "This is how families should work," the priest had told Jacob quietly as they watched the children practice their prayers together, not bound by law or blood alone, but by love and choice and commitment to each other's well-being. "You have built something beautiful here, something that reflects the best of what God intends for us." The priest's endorsement carried particular weight in a community where religious authority still commanded deep respect, and Jacob knew that Father Santos's letter of support would be difficult for even Marcus Whitfield to dismiss or discredit. But perhaps the most powerful ally had emerged from within the community itself. As winter deepened and the isolation of mountain life brought families closer together, several of Cedar Ridge's residents had begun to see the Stone family not as an aberration to be corrected, but as an example of the kind of neighborly care that frontier communities depended on for survival. When the Henderson family's youngest child had fallen through thin ice on the creek that ran behind their property, it was Grace who had spotted the accident during one of her walks with Tommy. Her quick thinking and loud cries for help had brought Jacob running, and his experience with mountain rescues had saved young Billy Henderson's life. "That little girl saved my boy," Mary Henderson had announced loudly at the next church social, her voice carrying clearly across the room to where Marcus Whitfield sat with his supporters. She could have just walked on by, minded her own business like so many people seem to think children should do. Instead, she risked her own safety to help someone who needed it. That's the kind of child Jacob Stone is raising up there, and anyone who has a problem with it can answer to me. Similar stories began to accumulate as word spread about the Stone family's quiet acts of neighborliness. When old Mr. Peterson had taken ill and couldn't tend his livestock, Tommy and Grace had volunteered to help with the daily chores, working together with the kind of cheerful competence that impressed the crusty old rancher, despite his initial skepticism about Stone's charity cases, that boy and girl work. "Harder and complain less than most adults I know," Peterson had grumbled to anyone who would listen. "Don't know what all the fuss is about. Seems to me Jacob's doing exactly what good neighbors are supposed to do." Even some of the children in town had begun to change their attitudes. Grace's artistic abilities had made her something of a celebrity among the younger set, and her willingness to share her talents, drawing pictures for children who couldn't afford store-bought toys, teaching other girls the techniques her educated mother had passed on to her, had gradually overcome the initial suspicion and resentment some of them had shown. But it was Grace's relationship with Tommy that provided the most powerful testimony to the success of their unconventional family. Anyone who spent 5 minutes watching them together could see that whatever technical questions might exist about legal guardianship and proper procedures, these two children had formed the kind of sibling bond that would last a lifetime. Tommy's protective instincts toward Grace had only strengthened over the months. He had appointed himself her guide to mountain life, teaching her wilderness skills with the patient enthusiasm of someone who truly cared about her safety and success. But Grace had also become Tommy's staunchest supporter, helping him with schoolwork that sometimes frustrated him, encouraging him when he felt discouraged. and providing the kind of understanding companionship that only someone who had also experienced loss could offer. They're good for each other. Mrs. Patterson observed one afternoon as she watched Grace and Tommy work together to organize the store's inventory, a task they had volunteered for without being asked. Tommy's learned to be more responsible and caring, and Grace has learned to be more confident and outgoing. That's what real families do. They make each other better. But even as Jacob accumulated evidence of their family's success and community acceptance, the opposition continued to organize against them. Marcus Whitfield had not been idle during these months, and his campaign against the Stone family had become more sophisticated and far-reaching. Whitfield had begun corresponding with territorial officials, presenting carefully crafted arguments about the dangers of allowing irregular adoptions to proceed without proper oversight. He had commissioned his own character references from prominent citizens in other towns, people who didn't know Jacob personally, but who were willing to express concern about the precedent his case might set. Most troubling, Whitfield had begun to suggest that there might be more to Grace's story than Jacob had revealed, that perhaps there were reasons beyond simple abandonment for why a well-educated child had ended up alone and destitute in the wilderness. These whispers were carefully crafted to sound like legitimate concerns rather than baseless accusations. But their effect was to cast doubt on Grace's background and, by extension, on Jacob's judgment in taking her in. All I'm saying, Whitfield would remark with calculated concern, is that we don't really know anything about this child's past. Children don't just appear out of nowhere, and perhaps there are reasons, perhaps there are people we should be considering before we allow this situation to become permanent. The implications were clear. Even if never stated directly, Grace might be running from something or someone, and Jacob's refusal to investigate her background thoroughly might be putting the entire community at risk. These whispers had begun to have their intended effect. Some community members who had been neutral or even supportive began to express doubts. What if there was more to Grace's story? What if Jacob's compassionate impulse had blinded him to potential dangers? What if the proper thing to do was indeed to turn her over to territorial authorities who had the resources to investigate her background properly? As winter deepened and the legal battle intensified, Jacob found himself fighting not just for his family's future, but for the very principles that had guided his decision to take Grace in. The question was no longer simply whether he could provide a good home for an orphaned child, but whether love and commitment were sufficient foundations for family, or whether legal procedures and social conventions were more important than the bonds people chose to create with each other. The answer to that question would determine not just Grace's fate, but the kind of community Cedar Ridge would become, one that valued compassion and individual choice, or one that prioritized conformity and institutional authority above all else. As Jacob tucked both children into their beds that cold December night, listening to their prayers and watching them settle into the peaceful sleep of children who felt completely secure and loved, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had already won the most important victory. He had given two children the gift of belonging, and they had given him the strength to fight for a future that honored the family they had chosen to become. January brought news that changed everything. Jacob was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the sound of hooves on the frozen trail, an unusual occurrence given the deep snow and bitter cold that had kept most travelers close to home for weeks. Tommy and Grace were inside working on their lessons, their voices carrying through the crisp air as they helped each other with arithmetic problems. The rider who emerged from the tree line was Sheriff Coleman, but his demeanor was entirely different from his usual calm professionalism. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperature, suggesting he had ridden hard from town, and his face carried an expression of barely controlled urgency. "Jacob," he called out as he dismounted, "we need to talk, now." The tone sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He set down his axe and gestured toward the cabin. Come inside where it's warm. But Coleman shook his head. Better if we talk out here first. What I have to tell you. Well, the children shouldn't hear it until we figure out what it means. Jacob felt his stomach drop. For months, he'd been fighting legal battles and social pressure, but those had been challenges he could understand and address through persistence and determination. The look on Coleman's face suggested something entirely different, something that threatened the very foundation of their family in ways he might not be able to control. "What is it?" Jacob asked quietly. Coleman pulled a folded telegram from his coat pocket. "This came through this morning from the Territorial Marshal's office. Jacob, they've been looking for Grace, not for adoption placement or legal guardianship. They've been looking for her as a witness." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. "A witness to what?" "Murder," Coleman said grimly. "Her parents weren't killed in some accident on the wagon train, like she told you. They were murdered, Jacob. Shot down in cold blood by a gang of claim jumpers who wanted the mining rights they'd discovered in California." Jacob stared at the sheriff, his mind struggling to process this information. Mining rights? Grace's father had filed claims on what turned out to be some of the richest gold deposits discovered in the territory in the past 5 years. Word got out somehow, and a gang led by a man named Black Pete Morrison decided they wanted those claims for themselves. They tracked the Hartwell family to their camp, and Coleman paused, his expression pained. "Jacob, Grace saw the whole thing. She was hiding in the wagon when it happened. She's the only witness who can identify Morrison and his men." The implications crashed over Jacob like an avalanche. Grace hadn't just been abandoned by fellow travelers. She'd been running for her life from killers who had murdered her parents in front of her eyes. The quiet, artistic child who drew pictures by their fireplace and helped Tommy with his prayers had witnessed horrors that would traumatize grown men. "Does she know?" Jacob asked. "Does she know they're looking for her?" "I don't think so," Coleman replied. "The telegram says she was reported as missing, presumed dead after the attack. The authorities have been searching for her for months, but they had no idea she'd made it this far east. Her appearing here, Jacob, it's nothing short of a miracle that she survived." Jacob looked toward the cabin, where he could still hear Grace and Tommy laughing over some shared discovery in their lessons. The normalcy of it, the simple joy of children learning together in a warm, safe space, felt precious and fragile in light of what Coleman had just revealed. "What do they want?" Jacob asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "They want her to testify. Morrison and 2 of his men were captured last month, and they're scheduled for trial in Sacramento in March. Grace's testimony is crucial. Without it, they might not be able to convict them for the murders." "She's 8 years old," Jacob said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They want to put an 8-year-old child through the trauma of reliving her parents' murder in front of a courtroom full of strangers." "I know," Coleman said quietly. "I know how it sounds. But Jacob, these men killed at least 6 people in addition to Grace's parents. If they're not convicted, they'll be free to kill again. And there's something else." He hesitated, then continued reluctantly. "The mining claims Grace inherited are worth a fortune. She's a very wealthy little girl, which means she'll never be truly safe as long as Morrison's associates are still out there." The weight of this revelation settled over Jacob like lead. Not only had their family's legal battles become exponentially more complicated, but Grace was now a target for violence in ways that made their isolated mountain cabin seem more like a trap than a refuge. "How long do we have?" Jacob asked. "The federal marshal will be here within the week to escort Grace to California for the trial," Coleman replied. "Jacob, I'm sorry. I know what this family means to you, what it means to all of you. But this is bigger than local adoption disputes now. This is federal law enforcement, and they have jurisdiction." Jacob nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications and possibilities. "Have you told anyone else about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, see if there might be some way." Coleman shook his head. "But Jacob, you need to know that Marcus Whitfield is going to hear about this soon enough. When he does, he's going to claim it proves everything he's been saying about the dangers of taking in children with unknown backgrounds." The irony was bitter. Jacob's critics had been claiming that Grace's past might be hiding dangerous secrets, and in a sense, they'd been right, though not in the way any of them had imagined. Grace wasn't dangerous herself, but she was connected to dangers that could threaten everyone around her. "I need to tell her," Jacob said finally. "She deserves to know the truth about what's happening." "Are you sure?" "She's been through so much already. Maybe it would be kinder to just let the marshal explain everything when he arrives." Jacob shook his head firmly. "She's part of this family. She has a right to know what we're facing, and she has a right to help decide how we face it." They walked toward the cabin together, the crunch of snow under their boots, marking time like a countdown to the moment when their carefully constructed peace would be shattered by the intrusion of a brutal outside world. Inside, Grace and Tommy looked up from their schoolwork with bright smiles that made Jacob's heart ache. They'd been working together on a drawing, Grace teaching Tommy some of the techniques her mother had taught her, and their faces glowed with the simple pleasure of shared accomplishment. "Sheriff Coleman," Tommy exclaimed. "Want to see what Grace taught me? I can draw horses now, and they actually look like horses." "That's wonderful, Tommy," Coleman replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Grace is a fine teacher." Grace studied the sheriff's face with the intuitive awareness that seemed to characterize children who'd experienced trauma. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly. Jacob sat down beside her, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "Grace, Sheriff Coleman has some news about your parents, about what really happened to them." He watched her face carefully as he explained what the telegram had revealed, seeing the exact moment when she realized that her careful story about wagon train accidents and kind strangers had been discovered. Her expression didn't change dramatically. She'd learned early to control her reactions, but Jacob saw the flash of fear and grief that crossed her eyes before she looked down at her folded hands. "You knew," Jacob said gently. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded slowly. "I knew they were murdered. I saw it happen. But I thought if people knew the truth, they might not want to help me. Or they might be scared of the bad men coming after them too." Tommy's face had gone pale as he processed this information. "Bad men killed your mom and papa?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "Very bad men who wanted something that belonged to my family." Tommy moved closer to her with the instinctive protectiveness that had characterized his relationship with Grace from the beginning. "Are they still looking for you?" "I don't know," Grace replied honestly. "I thought they might think I was dead too." "Well, they're not going to hurt you now," Tommy declared with fierce determination. "Because you're part of our family, and we protect each other." Jacob felt his throat tighten at his son's unwavering loyalty, even in the face of dangers he couldn't fully comprehend. "Tommy's right, Grace. We're going to protect you. But there's something else you need to know." He explained about the trial, about the federal marshal who would be coming to escort her to California, about the testimony she would need to give to ensure that her parents' killers were brought to justice. Grace listened in silence, her face composed, but her hands trembling slightly in Jacob's grip. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd heard. "Do I have to go?" And she asked finally. "The federal authorities believe you do," Jacob replied. "But Grace, this decision affects all of us. You're not alone in this anymore. Whatever we decide together as a family." Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Jacob, I don't think you understand. This isn't really a decision. Federal marshals don't ask permission. They have the authority to compel testimony in murder cases." "Maybe," Jacob said quietly. "But they'll have to find her first." The sheriff's eyes widened. "Jacob, you can't be thinking of—" "I'm thinking of protecting my daughter," Jacob interrupted, his voice carrying a steel that made both Coleman and Tommy straighten in their chairs. "I'm thinking that she's been through enough trauma for one lifetime, and that forcing her to relive her parents' murder in front of strangers and killers might do more harm than good. But if those men go free because she doesn't testify," Coleman began, "then that's on the law enforcement officers who failed to gather sufficient evidence, not on an 8-year-old girl who's already sacrificed more than anyone should have to," Jacob replied firmly. Grace looked up at him with an expression of such gratitude and love that it nearly broke his heart. "You really won't let them make me go?" "Not if there's any way to prevent it," Jacob promised. But even as he made that commitment, Jacob knew that the challenges they'd faced so far, legal opposition, social disapproval, bureaucratic obstacles, were nothing compared to what was coming. Federal authorities had resources and power that local opposition couldn't match, and their isolated mountain home could become a trap as easily as a refuge. Moreover, Marcus Whitfield and his supporters would seize on this revelation as proof that they'd been right all along about the dangers of Jacob's unconventional approach to family building. The fact that Grace's past contained genuine secrets and real danger would vindicate everything they'd been saying about proper procedures and institutional oversight. But as Jacob looked at Grace and Tommy, at their small hands clasped together in mutual support, at the trust and love in their eyes as they looked to him for protection and guidance, he knew that he would face any challenge, fight any battle, to preserve the family they had built together. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the pine trees, with a sound like distant voices carrying warnings of storms to come. But inside their warm cabin, surrounded by Grace's drawings and filled with the evidence of their shared life, Jacob Stone prepared for the fight of his life, not just for the right to call Grace his daughter, but for the very survival of the family they had chosen to become. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since Sheriff Coleman's arrival, Jacob felt something approaching hope. Because whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as individuals, but as a family, bound together by love and choice, and the absolute refusal to let the brutal realities of the outside world destroy the beautiful thing they had created. Together, 3 days after Sheriff Coleman's revelation, a stranger arrived at the stone cabin. Jacob first spotted him from the woodshed, where he'd been preparing kindling for the evening fire. A tall, well-dressed man in a long coat, riding a fine horse that looked distinctly out of place on the rough mountain trail. The visitor moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, and Jacob's instincts, honed by years of frontier living, immediately went on high alert. "Grace, Tommy," Jacob called quietly through the cabin door. "Come away from the windows and stay inside until I tell you otherwise." The children obeyed without question, understanding from Jacob's tone that this wasn't a time for curiosity or argument. Jacob checked the rifle that he kept loaded above the door, a precaution that had seemed unnecessary during their peaceful months as a family, but now felt like prudent preparation. The stranger dismounted near the front porch, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. But Jacob noticed that he kept his hand near the gun on his hip, the unconscious habit of someone who'd learned to be ready for trouble at all times. "Mr. Stone," the visitor called out. "My name is Daniel Hawthorne. I'm an attorney from San Francisco, and I need to speak with you about Grace Hartwell." Jacob stepped onto the porch, the rifle held casually but visibly at his side. "What's your business with my daughter?" Hawthorne's eyebrows rose slightly at the possessive pronoun, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "I represent the Hartwell estate, Mr. Stone. I've been searching for Grace for months, ever since her parents' death. There are significant legal and financial matters that require her attention." "I'm aware of the legal matters," Jacob replied carefully. "Sheriff Coleman informed me about the federal marshal's interest in Grace's testimony." "The criminal case is only part of the issue," Hawthorne said. "Mr. Stone, may I speak plainly? Grace Hartwell is one of the wealthiest children in the Western Territories. Her father's mining claims are worth more than most people see in a lifetime, and her mother came from a prominent Boston family with significant holdings of their own. The child inside your cabin is heiress to a fortune that would make her a target for every fortune hunter and criminal from here to California." Jacob felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He'd known from Sheriff Coleman's report that Grace had inherited mining claims, but he'd assumed they represented potential future wealth, not an existing fortune. The implications of what Hawthorne was saying were staggering. "What exactly are you telling me?" Jacob asked. Hawthorne reached into his coat, moving slowly to avoid alarming Jacob, and withdrew a leather portfolio. Grace's father wasn't just a school teacher seeking his fortune in California, Mr. Stone. Thomas Hartwell was the son of a wealthy Boston shipping family. He and his wife were traveling west, not out of necessity, but because they wanted their daughter to experience the adventure of frontier, life before she came of age and inherited responsibilities that would tie her to Eastern society forever. He handed Jacob a document from the portfolio. This is a copy of Thomas Hartwell's will, filed with the territorial court in Sacramento. Grace inherits everything, mining claims worth approximately $200,000, trust funds established by her maternal grandmother, and property holdings in Boston worth at least half that much again. Jacob stared at the legal document, his mind struggling to process numbers that seemed almost fictional. Grace, the frightened, hungry child who had collapsed on the steps of the general store, was wealthy beyond anything Jacob could imagine. "Why are you telling me this?" Jacob asked. "Because someone has to protect her interests," Hawthorne replied. "The mining claims alone make her a target for every claim jumper and outlaw in the territory. The Boston inheritance makes her attractive to fortune hunters who would be perfectly willing to marry an 8-year-old and wait for her to come of age. And the combination makes her valuable enough to kidnap or kill if other approaches fail." The lawyer's words confirmed Jacob's worst fears about the dangers Grace faced. But they also raised new questions about the man's motives for seeking her out. "What's your interest in this?" Jacob asked bluntly. Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. "Professional responsibility, primarily. I was retained by Thomas Hartwell to handle his legal affairs and ensure his family's protection if anything happened to him. But also," he paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue, "also personal obligation. Thomas Hartwell was my friend, Mr. Stone. We attended Harvard together, served in the war together. When he decided to take his family west, I tried to talk him out of it. I told him it was too dangerous, that he was risking everything for an adventure that could cost him his life." The lawyer's voice grew heavy with regret. "I was right, but being right doesn't make me feel any better about losing my friend. What it does mean is that I have a responsibility to protect his daughter, a responsibility I take very seriously indeed." Jacob studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives, but saw only the genuine grief of someone who had lost a friend and was struggling to honor that friendship's obligations. "Assuming you're legitimate," Jacob said, "what exactly are you proposing?" "That's complicated," Hawthorne admitted. "Legally, Grace needs a guardian who can protect not just her physical safety, but also her financial interests. That means someone with the legal standing to make decisions about her property, the resources to provide proper security, and the social connections to navigate the complex world of inherited wealth." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Someone like you? Someone like the people I represent," Hawthorne corrected. "Grace's maternal grandparents are still alive, Mr. Stone. They're prominent members of Boston society with the means and motivation to provide their granddaughter with every advantage. They've been searching for her since word of the murders reached them, and they're prepared to take full responsibility for her care and education." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He'd been preparing to fight federal marshals and territorial bureaucrats. But the prospect of fighting wealthy grandparents with legitimate legal claims was exponentially more daunting. "She belongs here," Jacob said quietly. "She belongs with us, does she?" Hawthorne asked gently. "Mr. Stone, I don't question your affection for Grace or your good intentions in taking her in. But can you honestly say that living in isolation on a mountain, however loving the environment, is what's best for a child with her background and prospects?" It was the same question Marcus Whitfield had been asking, but coming from Hawthorne, it carried different weight. This wasn't small-town prejudice or social disapproval. This was a legitimate challenge to Jacob's ability to provide Grace with the opportunities her inheritance would make possible. "What opportunities?" Jacob asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "Education at the finest schools in the country," Hawthorne said. introduction to society that would prepare her to manage significant financial holdings, protection from the very real dangers that her wealth will attract for the rest of her life. Mr. Stone, Grace will never be able to live a normal life. Her inheritance makes that impossible. She needs to be prepared for the responsibilities and dangers that come with great wealth. Jacob looked toward the cabin, where Grace and Tommy were probably listening at the door, despite his instructions to stay away from windows. The life Hawthorne was describing sounded like a gilded prison, safe and privileged, but utterly disconnected from the simple joys of mountain life, family closeness, and the freedom to be a child without the weight of massive responsibilities. Have you spoken to Grace about this? Jacob asked. Not yet. I wanted to discuss the situation with you first, out of respect for the care you've shown her. Hawthorne paused. But Mr. Stone, my authority doesn't depend on her preferences or yours. I have legal documents giving me responsibility for her welfare, and if necessary, I'm prepared to use them. The threat was politely stated, but unmistakably clear. Jacob could cooperate with Grace's transition to her grandparents' care, or Hawthorne would compel that transition through legal channels that Jacob would have no power to challenge. I need to talk to Grace, Jacob said finally. She has a right to know what you're proposing. Of course, Hawthorne agreed. But Mr. Stone, I should warn you, this isn't a negotiation. Grace's grandparents have already made arrangements for her transport to Boston. I'm here as a courtesy to ensure the transition happens as smoothly as possible for everyone involved. Jacob felt anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help Grace, and it certainly wouldn't change the legal realities they were facing. Inside the cabin, Grace and Tommy sat huddled together near the fireplace, their faces reflecting the anxiety they'd absorbed from the tense adult conversation happening outside. When Jacob entered with Hawthorne behind him, Grace immediately moved closer to Tommy, her hand instinctively reaching for the chain around her neck where Sarah's ring rested alongside her mother's. Grace, Jacob said gently, kneeling down to her level. This gentleman is Mr. Hawthorne. He's a lawyer who knew your father, and he has something important to tell you about your family. Hawthorne removed his hat and approached carefully, his demeanor shifting to the kind of gentle formality adults used when addressing children of significant social standing. Hello, Grace, he said softly. I'm very sorry for your loss. Your father was a good friend of mine, and he spoke of you often. He was very proud of you. Grace studied his face with the cautious intelligence that had become her trademark. You knew Papa, I did. We went to school together, and we remained close friends even after he decided to bring your family west. Hawthorne settled into a chair across from her, his movements careful and non-threatening. Grace, your father asked me to look after you if anything ever happened to him and your mother. That's why I'm here. I'm being looked after, Grace said quietly, glancing at Jacob. I have a family now. I understand that, Hawthorne replied. And I can see that Mr. Stone and Tommy care about you very much. But Grace, there are things about your family that you might not know, things that change what's possible for your future. Jacob watched as Hawthorne explained Grace's inheritance, using language carefully chosen for a child's understanding, but not talking down to her obvious intelligence. He told her about the mining claims her father had discovered, about the wealth she'd inherited from her mother's family, about grandparents in Boston who had been searching for her since news of the tragedy reached them. Grace listened in silence, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. When Hawthorne finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. I don't want to be rich, she said simply. I just want to stay here with my family. Hawthorne's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I understand, Grace, but wanting something and being able to have it aren't always the same thing. Your inheritance means you have responsibilities and dangers that can't be ignored. What kind of responsibilities? Tommy asked, speaking up for the first time since Hawthorne's arrival. Hawthorne looked at Jacob as if asking permission to continue. Jacob nodded reluctantly. Both children deserved to understand the full scope of what they were facing. When someone has as much money as Grace will inherit, They become responsible for managing it wisely, Hawthorne explained. That means understanding business and investments, learning how to tell honest people from those who might try to take advantage, and being prepared to make decisions that affect not just yourself, but everyone who depends on that wealth. He paused, then continued more seriously. It also means being constantly careful about safety. People have killed for much less money than Grace will control, and there will always be those who see her fortune as an opportunity for their own gain. Tommy's face had gone pale. You mean bad people will always be trying to hurt Grace? Not always, Hawthorne said carefully. But the possibility will always exist. That's why she needs to be somewhere safe, with people who understand how to protect someone in her position. We can protect her, Tommy said fiercely. Pa's really strong, and I'm learning to shoot and— Tommy, Jacob said gently, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The boy's loyalty was touching, but Jacob was beginning to understand the impossible nature of their situation. Grace's inheritance didn't just make her wealthy. It made her a permanent target, in ways that their isolated mountain life couldn't address. Grace looked up at Jacob with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. Do I have to go with him? Jacob felt his heart breaking as he realized that honesty meant acknowledging his own limitations. Grace, Mr. Hawthorne has legal authority to make decisions about your welfare. More than that, though, he's right about the dangers you face. The kind of people who killed your parents, they're not going to stop looking for you. And they're not going to be deterred by mountain trails or winter weather. But you said we'd fight for our family, Tommy protested. You promised we'd stick together. Sometimes fighting for your family means making sure they're safe. Even if that means being apart, Jacob replied, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Grace reached into her dress and pulled out the mining deed, a document Jacob hadn't known she possessed. It was folded and worn, as if it had been handled many times, and Jacob realized she'd been carrying this burden of knowledge for months without sharing it with anyone. I found this in Papa's things after they died, she said quietly. I knew it was important, but I didn't understand what it meant. I thought maybe if I kept it hidden, the bad men wouldn't be able to find what they were looking for. Hawthorne's eyes widened as he examined the deed. Grace, this is the original filing for the Hartwell claims? The authorities have been working from copies. This document could be worth even more than we estimated. Grace looked at the paper as if it were a poisonous snake. I wish Papa had never found any gold. I wish we'd just stayed in the wagon train and gone to California like everyone else. But you didn't, Hawthorne said gently. And now we have to deal with the situation as it is, not as we wish it could be. Jacob watched Grace struggle with the enormity of her situation, saw the way she looked back and forth between the document that represented her inheritance and the simple cabin that represented the only happiness she'd known since her parents' death. If I go with you, she asked finally, will I ever be able to come back? Hawthorne hesitated before answering. Grace, your grandparents love you very much, even though they've never met you. They want to give you every opportunity, the best education, a chance to take your place in society. But that kind of life requires certain commitments. It's not the kind of life where you can spend summers in mountain cabins or have a brother like Tommy, Grace finished quietly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jacob saw Tommy's face crumple with the realization that their family, the most important thing in his young life, was being dissolved by forces beyond any of their control. There has to be another way, Jacob said desperately. Some compromise that protects Grace but doesn't destroy our family. Hawthorne shook his head sadly. Mr. Stone, I wish there were. But Grace's safety requires resources and connections that simply aren't available in frontier communities. Her education requires schools and teachers that don't exist outside major cities. Her inheritance requires legal and financial management that demands constant attention from experts. He stood up, preparing to deliver the final blow. Moreover, her grandparents have already obtained legal custody through the territorial courts. I'm not here to ask permission. I'm here to arrange the details of her transfer to their care." Jacob felt the walls of his world crashing down around him. Everything they'd built together, every moment of happiness and security they'd created, was being swept away by legal documents and financial realities he couldn't fight or change. But as he looked at Grace, at the quiet dignity with which she was facing this impossible situation, at the way she reached out to take Tommy's hand in a gesture of comfort, despite her own distress, Jacob realized that she'd grown into someone remarkable during their months together. The frightened, abandoned child who'd collapsed on the store steps had become a young person, capable of grace under pressure, loyalty in the face of loss, and love that transcended circumstances. Whatever happened next, Jacob knew that their time together hadn't been wasted. Grace would carry the lessons of family love and mountain strength with her wherever she went, just as he and Tommy would carry the gift of having known her and loved her during the brief, beautiful time when she was truly theirs. The mining deed that had brought such tragedy to her family was about to tear her away from the new family that had healed her heart. But the document itself wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure was the love they'd shared and the people they'd become because of that love. As Hawthorne prepared the legal papers that would formalize Grace's departure, Jacob held both children close and wondered if love was strong enough to survive the separation that seemed inevitable, or if some battles were simply too big for even the strongest hearts to win. The revelation of Jacob's military past came in the darkest hour, when all seemed lost and hope had nearly died. It was Tommy who discovered it, 2 days after Hawthorne's devastating visit. While Grace sat by the window staring out at the snow-covered peaks with the hollow expression of someone who had learned too young that happiness was temporary and love could be taken away without warning, Tommy had been trying desperately to find some way to cheer Grace up, some small gift or gesture that might bring back the smile that had been absent since they'd learned of her impending departure. In his 8-year-old reasoning, he'd decided that maybe one of his father's possessions might serve as a permanent reminder of their family, something Grace could take to Boston as a proof that she'd been loved and wanted here. He'd been rummaging through Jacob's personal belongings, looking for something small and precious that Grace might treasure, when his fingers found a wooden box hidden beneath folded clothing at the bottom of the chest. The box itself was unremarkable, simple pine construction with no decoration, but it was locked. And that mystery made it irresistible to a child looking for answers to impossible problems. "Pa," Tommy called from the bedroom. "What's in this box?" Jacob looked up from the legal documents he'd been studying, papers that seemed to grow more hopeless with each reading. Hawthorne had left him copies of everything: custody orders, inheritance documents, travel arrangements, and each page reinforced the futility of fighting forces so much larger than himself. "What box, son?" Tommy appeared in the doorway, holding the wooden container that Jacob had hoped never to open again. The sight of it sent a jolt through Jacob's chest, memories he'd spent years trying to bury, of a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. This one. "It was hidden under your clothes." Jacob stared at the box, his mind torn between the desire to take it from Tommy's hands and lock it away forever, and the growing realization that perhaps the time for hiding from his past had finally ended. "Tommy, put that back where you found it," Jacob said quietly, but Grace, drawn by the conversation and perhaps sensing that this mysterious box might contain some clue to Jacob's character, looked up from her vigil by the window. "What is it, Mr. Stone?" she asked, using the formal address she'd reverted to since learning of her impending departure, a heartbreaking return to the careful distance she'd maintained when she'd first arrived. Frightened and unsure of her welcome. "It's nothing important, Grace, just old things from before you and Tommy were born." But Tommy, with the persistence of childhood and the desperation of someone watching his family dissolve, refused to be deterred. "If it's not important, why is it locked? And why was it hidden?" Jacob found himself caught between his son's innocent curiosity and his own need to protect both children from truths that might be too heavy for them to bear. But as he looked at Grace, at the resignation in her eyes, at the way she'd begun to withdraw from them in preparation for the separation she believed was inevitable, he realized that perhaps it was time for complete honesty. "Grace, come here," Jacob said quietly. "Both of you, sit down." They gathered around the small table where they'd shared so many meals and lessons, where Grace had drawn countless pictures and Tommy had practiced his letters. Jacob held the box for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, before reaching into his pocket for the key he'd carried for 15 years without ever using. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet cabin. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay objects that belonged to a different man from a different time, medals and ribbons, a formal military photograph, and documents that told a story Jacob had never shared with anyone. Tommy reached for the photograph first, his young eyes wide with amazement. "Pa, is this you?" Jacob looked at the image. A much younger version of himself, in a crisp blue uniform, standing at attention with the kind of military bearing that spoke to years of discipline and command. The man in the photograph looked confident and dangerous, nothing like the quiet mountain logger his children knew. "That was taken in 1863, Jacob said quietly. "When I was a major in the Union Army." "You were a soldier?" Grace asked, her first spark of genuine interest since Hawthorne's visit. "More than that," Jacob replied, lifting one of the medals from its cloth wrapping. "I was a cavalry commander. Later, I was part of a special unit that handled situations other soldiers couldn't manage." The medal caught the firelight, its gold surface reflecting memories of battles fought and won, of missions accomplished despite impossible odds. Tommy examined it with the reverence children show to objects that represent adult mysteries beyond their understanding. "What did you do in the war, Pa?" Jacob hesitated, looking at both children, at Tommy's eager curiosity and Grace's cautious interest. They were facing their own war now, a battle for their family's survival that seemed just as hopeless as some of the missions Jacob had undertaken as a young officer. "I led men into impossible situations," Jacob said finally. "When conventional approaches failed, when the enemy seemed too strong or too clever, that's when they called on my unit. We specialized in what the military called irregular warfare, using intelligence, strategy, and unconventional tactics to achieve objectives that couldn't be accomplished through direct confrontation." He pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. "This is a Congressional Medal of Honor citation. It was awarded for a mission behind Confederate lines that saved 2,000 Union prisoners and disrupted enemy supply lines for 6 months." Grace leaned forward to examine the document, her educated background allowing her to understand the significance of what she was seeing. "You're a hero," she said quietly. "I was a soldier who did his duty," Jacob corrected. "But Grace, the skills I learned in the war, strategy, tactics, understanding how to fight against superior forces, those skills don't disappear just because you become a logger and a father." Tommy looked confused. "Why didn't you ever tell us about this?" Jacob rewrapped the medal carefully before answering. "Because I wanted to put that life behind me. I wanted to be someone different, someone who solved problems with work and patience instead of warfare and violence. When your mother died, Tommy, I thought those days were over forever. But they're not?" Grace asked, and Jacob could see the beginning of hope flickering in her eyes, the first sign of life he'd seen from her in days. "No," Jacob said firmly, "they're not." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had been their refuge, but might now become their battleground. "Grace, you asked if there was any way you could stay with us, any compromise that might let our family remain together. Everyone, Hawthorne, your grandparents, the territorial authorities, they all assume that I'm just a simple mountain man without the resources or connections to protect you properly." Jacob turned back to face both children, and for the first time since Hawthorne's visit, His expression held something other than resignation. "They're wrong." Over the next hour, Jacob began to explain the network of contacts he'd maintained. From his military service, men who'd served under his command and gone on to positions of influence and authority throughout the Western territories. He told them about resources he'd never accessed, connections he'd never used, and skills he'd hoped never to need again. "Colonel Marcus Walsh commands the territorial militia," Jacob explained, pulling names and positions from a memory he'd tried to bury. "James Morrison, no relation to the outlaw, runs the Federal Marshal's office in Denver. General Patrick O'Connor oversees territorial security from his headquarters in San Francisco." Grace listened with growing amazement as Jacob revealed the scope of his military connections. "They would help us?" "They owe me," Jacob said simply. "More than that, they understand loyalty and duty in ways that civilian authorities sometimes don't. If I called in old favors, if I explained the situation properly, you could fight the legal orders?" Tommy asked eagerly. Jacob shook his head. "Not fight them directly, but I could make sure Grace has proper protection while the legal issues are resolved. I could ensure that any decisions about her future are made with full consideration of what's actually in her best interests, rather than what's most convenient for wealthy relatives she's never met." He pulled out the last item from the box, a small leather journal filled with names, addresses, and coded references that represented 15 years of careful networking and mutual obligation among military veterans. "Grace, your inheritance makes you valuable to criminals, but it also makes you important to people who might be willing to help if they understood the full situation. The difference between being a target and being protected isn't just about having money, it's about having the right allies and knowing how to use them." For the first time since Hawthorne's visit, Grace smiled, a small tentative expression, but real hope nonetheless. "You really think there's a way?" "I think," Jacob said carefully, "that there are options we haven't explored yet. And I think that your father would want me to fight for you with everything I have, using every skill and connection I possess." Tommy jumped up with renewed energy. "What do we do first, Pa?" Jacob looked at both children, at their eager faces and restored hope, and felt something he'd thought was lost forever, the familiar surge of confidence that came from having a plan, from knowing that even in the face of superior forces, there were always strategies available to those willing to think unconventionally and act decisively. "First, we send some messages," Jacob said, reaching for paper and ink. "Then we prepare for a different kind of battle than anyone expects." As he began composing the first of several letters that would activate networks dormant for over a decade, Jacob realized that the quiet mountain man he'd become was about to rediscover the strategic commander he'd once been. The stakes were higher than any military mission he'd ever undertaken. This time, he was fighting not for territory or political objectives, but for the survival of love itself. Outside, snow continued to fall on the mountain peaks, but inside their cabin, the Stone family was no longer waiting passively for others to decide their fate. They were planning, strategizing, and preparing to fight the most important battle of their lives, a battle that would determine whether love was strong enough to overcome law, whether family bonds chosen freely could survive the opposition of wealth and authority, and whether one man's willingness to use every weapon in his arsenal could protect the people he loved from forces that seemed infinitely more powerful. The real war was about to begin. But for the first time since learning of Grace's inheritance, Jacob Stone felt like they had a chance to win it. The confrontation Jacob had been preparing for arrived 3 days later, but not in the form he'd expected. Instead of federal marshals or territorial officials, it was Marcus Whitfield who rode up the mountain trail, accompanied by 2 men Jacob didn't recognize, hard-looking individuals who carried themselves like professional gunmen rather than local ranchers or town officials. Jacob spotted them from the ridge above the cabin, where he'd been checking the snares Tommy had set along the deer paths. His military instincts, sharpened by recent revelations and growing urgency, immediately catalogued the threat: 3 armed men approaching his home while his children were inside, their posture and formation suggesting hostile intent rather than social visit. He slipped quietly through the pine trees, using skills he hadn't employed in 15 years to position himself where he could observe without being seen. What he witnessed made his blood run cold. Whitfield dismounted near the cabin door with the confident swagger of a man who believed he held all the advantages. The 2 gunmen flanked him, their hands resting casually on their weapons, not drawn but ready. Jacob could hear their conversation clearly in the crisp mountain air. "Remember," Whitfield was saying, "we're here on official business. The Territorial Court has granted emergency custody to Grace Hartwell's legal guardians, and we're simply ensuring that custody is properly enforced." One of the gunmen spat in the snow. "What if Stone doesn't see it that way?" "Then we explain the situation more forcefully," Whitfield replied with cold satisfaction. "A man who would kidnap and hide a wealthy heiress might pose a danger to the child's safety. It might become necessary to remove her from his custody immediately, by whatever means required." Jacob felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm and think strategically. Whitfield wasn't here as a concerned citizen or even as an opponent in a legal dispute. He was here to take Grace by force, using forged or fraudulent court orders as justification. Moving silently through the forest, Jacob circled around to approach the cabin from the back, where a small window would allow him to signal the children without alerting Whitfield to his presence. Through the glass, he could see Grace and Tommy huddled together near the fireplace, both of them clearly frightened by the sound of approaching horses and adult voices. Jacob tapped quietly on the window, using a code he'd taught both children for emergencies. Grace looked up immediately, relief flooding her face when she saw him. Jacob gestured for her to open the window. "Take Tommy and hide in the root cellar," he whispered urgently. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe, no matter what you hear happening up here." "What's wrong, Pa?" Tommy asked, his young face pale with fear. "Just do as I say, son." "And Grace," Jacob pulled out a small leather pouch he'd prepared the night before. "If something happens to me, use this money to get to Sheriff Coleman. Give him this note and tell him to contact Colonel Walsh immediately." Grace took the pouch with steady hands, despite her obvious fear. "We'll be careful," she promised. Jacob watched them slip out the back door and disappear into the root cellar, pulling the concealed entrance closed behind them. Then he moved to the front of the cabin, stepping onto the porch with his rifle held ready, but not obviously threatening. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "what can I do for you?" Whitfield's face showed surprise at Jacob's sudden appearance, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Jacob, we need to discuss Grace Hartwell's situation." "I wasn't aware there was a situation that required discussion," Jacob replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the tension crackling in the air. "Don't play games," Whitfield snapped, his veneer of civility slipping. "That child doesn't belong to you, and you have no legal right to keep her here. We have court orders authorizing her removal to proper guardianship." "I'd like to see those orders," Jacob said. Whitfield produced a document from his coat, but held it at a distance that made examination impossible. "Territorial Court ruling signed yesterday. Grace Hartwell is to be remanded immediately to the custody of appointed guardians pending resolution of inheritance matters." Jacob didn't need to examine the papers closely to know they were either fraudulent or obtained through false representation. The timing was wrong. Hawthorne would have mentioned any pending court actions, and territorial courts didn't issue emergency custody orders without proper notice and hearing. "I'm afraid I can't comply with that request," Jacob said quietly. "It's not a request," one of the gunmen interrupted, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "It's a legal order, and you'll comply or face the consequences." Jacob's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle straightening that spoke to years of military command and the absolute confidence that came from having faced far more dangerous men than these. "The consequences," Jacob said, his voice carrying a new authority that made all 3 visitors step back slightly. Depend entirely on what you're actually planning to do here. Whitfield's face flushed with anger. We're planning to take custody of Grace Hartwell, as ordered by the territorial court. If you interfere with lawful authority— What lawful authority? Jacob interrupted. Marcus, I know you well enough to recognize a lie when I hear one. You don't have legitimate court orders. You don't have legal standing to remove anyone from my custody. And you certainly don't have the authority to bring armed men onto my property to threaten my family. The accusation hit home. Jacob could see it in the way. Whitfield's eyes narrowed and his companions shifted nervously. But instead of backing down, Whitfield's expression hardened with something like desperate determination. All right, he said, dropping any pretense of legal authority. You want the truth. Here's the truth. That child is sitting on a fortune that's wasted up here in the mountains with a man who doesn't understand what real wealth means or how to protect it properly. She needs to be with people who can manage her inheritance responsibly, people who understand the obligations that come with serious money. People like you, Jacob said, understanding finally clicking into place. Whitfield's smile was cold and predatory. People exactly like me. Jacob, you're a decent man, but you're out of your depth here. Grace Hartwell's inheritance could transform this entire region, fund development, create opportunities, bring civilization to these mountains. All it takes is proper management by people who understand business and investment, and you've appointed yourself as that proper management. I've appointed myself as someone who won't waste the opportunity, Whitfield corrected. Grace is a child. She'll do what she's told by the adults responsible for her care. If those adults happen to be people who understand how to put her wealth to productive use, while skimming a healthy percentage for themselves, Jacob finished. Whitfield shrugged. Everyone benefits. Grace gets proper care and education. The community gets development and investment. And yes, the people managing her affairs get compensated for their expertise. It's a perfectly reasonable arrangement. Jacob felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Whitfield's opposition to Grace's adoption hadn't been about moral concerns or proper procedures. It had been about money. He'd recognized her potential value long before anyone else and had been working systematically to position himself as her guardian and financial manager. There's just one problem with your plan, Jacob said quietly. What's that? Jacob's smile was thin and dangerous. Grace isn't going anywhere with you. Whitfield's patience finally snapped completely. She is, Jacob, one way or another. You can hand her over peacefully, or we can take her by force. But we're not leaving this mountain without that child. The threat was now completely in the open, all pretense of legality abandoned. Jacob found himself facing exactly the kind of situation his military training had prepared him for. Overwhelming odds, hostile forces, and the absolute necessity of protecting innocent lives regardless of the personal cost. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with, Jacob said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded troops in battle and led impossible missions against superior forces. I understand perfectly, Whitfield replied. You're a washed-up logger who thinks he can play father to a child worth more than this entire town. But money talks louder than sentiment, Jacob. And money says Grace Hartwell belongs with people who know how to use wealth properly. Jacob's response was cut off by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast up the mountain trail. For a moment, everyone froze, uncertain whether the new arrivals represented reinforcement or complication. But Jacob recognized the lead rider before the others did, and for the first time since this confrontation began, he allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Colonel Marcus Walsh had received his message and responded with characteristic military efficiency. Behind him rode 6 men in civilian clothes, but with unmistakable military bearing, veterans who had served under Jacob's command and who had come immediately, when called upon by their former officer, Mr. Stone. Colonel Walsh called out as he dismounted, his formal address carrying the weight of official authority. Sorry we're late. Had to collect some documentation from the territorial capital on our way up. Jacob's smile widened as he saw the papers in Walsh's hand. Genuine court orders, federal authorization, and military jurisdiction documentation that would override whatever fraudulent papers Whitfield might be carrying. The real battle was just beginning. But suddenly, the odds had shifted dramatically in favor of the Stone family. The transformation in Marcus Whitfield's demeanor was immediate and complete. The confident authority he displayed moments earlier evaporated as he recognized the military precision of the approaching riders and the official bearing of their commander. His two gunmen shifted nervously, suddenly aware that they were outmanned and outgunned by professionals who moved with the deadly competence of combat veterans. "Colonel Walsh," Jacob said, inclining his head with military respect. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Major Stone," Walsh replied, using Jacob's wartime rank with deliberate emphasis. "When I received your message about threats to the Hartwell heiress, I contacted my colleagues in San Francisco immediately. What we discovered was most illuminating. Walsh pulled out a leather portfolio containing official documents, his movements precise and authoritative. "Mr. Whitfield, I believe you're operating under some significant misunderstandings about the legal status of Grace Hartwell's guardianship." Whitfield's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his bluster. "Colonel, I don't know what Jacob has told you, but this is a civilian matter concerning the proper placement of an orphaned child." Military jurisdiction applies," Walsh interrupted, "when crimes against federal officials are involved, and when inheritance disputes involve mining claims on federal land, and most relevantly, when fraud is committed using forged territorial court orders." The last statement hit Whitfield like a physical blow. His eyes widened as he realized how completely his scheme had unraveled. "You see, Mr. Whitfield," Walsh continued, "we took the liberty of verifying the authenticity of various court documents that have been circulating regarding Miss Hartwell's custody. The territorial court clerk was very helpful in explaining which orders are legitimate and which are—" He paused meaningfully. "The creative interpretations of legal procedure." Jacob watched. Whitfield's companions edge away from him as they began to understand the scope of their employer's deception and their own potential legal jeopardy. Men willing to enforce what they believed were legitimate court orders were considerably less enthusiastic about participating in kidnapping and fraud. "Now then," Walsh said, his tone becoming businesslike. "Major Stone has requested military protection for Miss Hartwell pending resolution of various legal challenges to her custody. Given the demonstrated threat to her safety and the federal interests involved in her inheritance, I'm authorized to grant that protection." He gestured to his men, who had positioned themselves strategically around the confrontation site with the unconscious competence of soldiers who had served together for years. "Sergeant Morrison, please escort Mr. Whitfield and his associates off Major Stone's property. If they resist or attempt to return, you have my authorization to place them under military arrest pending federal investigation of their activities." "Yes, sir," Morrison replied, his hand resting casually but visibly on his sidearm. Whitfield's last gambit was desperate and revealing. "You can't do this. Grace Hartwell is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She needs proper management, proper supervision. A man like Jacob Stone doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with that kind of wealth." "You're absolutely right," Walsh said calmly. "Grace Hartwell does need proper management and supervision, which is why Major Stone will be appointed as her legal guardian, with full military protection and federal oversight of her inheritance." Jacob felt his breath catch. This was more than he'd dared hope for, not just protection from Whitfield's schemes, but actual legal recognition of his parental rights. "You see," Walsh continued, clearly enjoying Whitfield's discomfiture, "Major Stone's military record includes extensive experience in logistics, supply management, and financial administration. His unit was responsible for managing captured assets worth millions of dollars during the war, and his integrity in those matters was beyond reproach." Walsh pulled out another document. "Moreover, his character references from fellow officers, Territorial officials and community members paint a picture of a man uniquely qualified to balance Grace's financial interests with her personal welfare. Jacob thought of the letters he'd sent. The old favors called in, the network of military brotherhood that had responded to his call for help. It had worked better than he'd ever imagined possible. This is illegal. Whitfield protested desperately. You can't use military authority to override civilian courts. We're not overriding civilian courts, Walsh replied. We're ensuring that civilian courts have accurate information about the situation before making final determinations. And about Miss Hartwell's future, he handed Jacob an official document bearing military seals and federal authorization. Major Stone, you are hereby appointed as temporary guardian of Grace Hartwell with full authority to make decisions regarding her welfare, education, and financial interests. This appointment will remain in effect pending formal civilian court proceedings, which will be conducted with proper notice and due process. Jacob accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that his family was finally safe from Whitfield's machinations. What about her grandparents in Boston? Jacob asked. Mr. Hawthorne said they have legal standing. Mr. Hawthorne represents legitimate interests, Walsh acknowledged. However, his clients were operating on incomplete information about Miss Hartwell's current circumstances and well-being. When presented with a full report of her situation, including character references, community support, and evidence of her own preferences, they've agreed to allow the territorial courts to make the final determination about custody. Jacob stared at the colonel. They're withdrawing their claim? Not withdrawing exactly, but they're agreeing to formal proceedings that consider Miss Hartwell's best interests, rather than simply asserting their legal rights as relatives. Walsh smiled slightly. It seems that wealthy Boston grandparents, when presented with evidence that their granddaughter is thriving in a loving home, are less interested in forcing traumatic changes than Mr. Hawthorne initially indicated. The sound of the root cellar opening drew everyone's attention. Grace emerged first, followed by Tommy, both children moving with the careful alertness of young people who had learned to read adult situations for signs of danger or safety. Grace's eyes went immediately to the official document in Jacob's hands. Is it over? She asked quietly. Jacob knelt down to her level, holding out the papers that guaranteed their family's future. It's over, sweetheart. You're home for good. The transformation in Grace's expression was like watching sunrise break over mountain peaks, joy and relief and love illuminating her face with radiant happiness. She threw herself into Jacob's arms with the abandon of a child who no longer had to guard her heart against the possibility of loss. Tommy joined the embrace immediately, his young arms encircling both his father and sister with fierce protectiveness. "We won!" he announced with satisfaction. "We really won?" "Yes, son," Jacob murmured into his hair. "We really won." Whitfield made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from his failed scheme. "This isn't over, Jacob. Grace's inheritance still needs proper management, and I still have connections." "Mr. Whitfield," Walsh interrupted with military coldness, "any further interference with Miss Hartwell's welfare will be considered harassment of a federal ward under military protection." "I trust I make myself clear?" Whitfield's shoulders sagged in defeat. The grand plan that would have made him wealthy and powerful had collapsed completely, leaving him with nothing but the prospect of federal investigation into his fraudulent activities. As Whitfield and his gunmen rode away in sullen defeat, Jacob felt the last of his tension finally release. The battle he'd been preparing for since Hawthorne's visit was over, won not through violence, but through the strategic application of old loyalties and military networks he'd almost forgotten he possessed. "Sir," Sergeant Morrison approached respectfully. "The colonel wanted me to give you this." Morrison handed Jacob a small leather case containing something that made his breath catch, a commission certificate bearing current date and official seals. "Colonel Walsh thought you might want to consider a return to active service," Morrison explained. There's a position opening up in territorial administration, someone to oversee federal interests in mining and land development. It would allow you to stay in the area while ensuring Miss Hartwell's inheritance is properly protected. Jacob stared at the commission, realizing that Walsh had thought of everything. Not only had he secured Grace's custody, but he'd provided Jacob with the professional standing and official authority to protect her interests permanently. "What does that mean, Pa?" Tommy asked, looking at the official papers with curious eyes. "It means," Jacob said slowly, "that I'm being offered a chance to serve my country again, while making sure that Grace's inheritance is used properly and that our family stays together." Grace looked up at him with shining eyes. "You would do that?" "Become a soldier again to keep us safe?" Jacob thought of the quiet mountain life he'd built, the simple pleasures of logging work and evening fires, the peace he'd found in putting his military past behind him. Then he looked at Grace and Tommy, at the family that had brought meaning back to his existence, and realized that some sacrifices were really opportunities in disguise. "Grace," he said seriously, "there's nothing I wouldn't do to keep our family together. If that means using old skills and taking on new responsibilities, then that's what I'll do." As Colonel Walsh prepared to depart with his men, leaving behind a small garrison to ensure the Stone family's continued protection, Jacob felt the weight of his new reality settling over him. He was no longer just a widowed logger raising his son in mountain isolation. He was the guardian of a wealthy heiress, a federal official with significant responsibilities, and the commander of resources that could shape the development of the entire territory. But as he watched Grace and Tommy work together to prepare supper for their unexpected military guests, chattering excitedly about the day's adventures and making plans for tomorrow's activities, Jacob knew that the most important part of his identity hadn't changed at all. He was still a father, still a man who believed that love was stronger than law, and that families were built through choice and commitment rather than blood and circumstance. The official papers and military appointments were just tools, means to protect what really mattered. Tommy's slingshot lay forgotten on the porch where he dropped it during the day's excitement, and Jacob picked it up with a smile. The simple weapon had seemed so inadequate against the forces threatening their family, but it represented something more important than its practical value. It represented the willingness of a small boy to fight for his sister, regardless of the odds. That willingness, multiplied and magnified through networks of loyalty and brotherhood, had proven stronger than wealth, more powerful than legal maneuvering, and more enduring than any threat Marcus Whitfield could devise. As evening settled over their mountain home, Jacob Stone stood on his porch, watching his children play in the snow, secure in the knowledge that love, when backed by determination and the right allies, really could conquer all. 6 months later, spring had come to the mountains with particular beauty, as if the world itself was celebrating the Stone family's victory over the forces that had tried to tear them apart. The cabin had been expanded with a new room for Grace and a small office where Jacob conducted his duties as territorial mining administrator, a position that allowed him to oversee Grace's inheritance while protecting the interests of other settlers and miners throughout the region. The legal battles were finally over. The territorial court had formalized Jacob's guardianship of Grace, recognizing not only his legal standing, but the clear evidence that she was thriving under his care. Her grandparents in Boston, after receiving detailed reports about her happiness and progress, had graciously withdrawn their custody claim, while establishing a trust fund that would ensure her continued education and future opportunities. Even more importantly, the criminal case that had started everything had reached its conclusion. Black Pete Morrison and his surviving associates had been convicted of murder and claim jumping, largely on the strength of Grace's brave testimony given via deposition rather than in open court. The mining claims that had brought such tragedy to her family were now producing steady income under Jacob's careful management. providing security for their future while funding development projects throughout the territory. Marcus Whitfield had left Cedar Ridge shortly after his failed attempt to seize Grace, his reputation destroyed and his business interests in ruins. Sheriff Coleman had made it clear that he was no longer welcome in the community, and federal investigators had found enough evidence of fraud and attempted kidnapping to ensure he faced serious legal consequences wherever he went. But for the Stone family, the most important changes weren't legal or financial. They were the simple, everyday miracles of a family that had found its permanent rhythm. Grace had blossomed into a confident, capable young lady who balanced her artistic talents with practical frontier skills and the business acumen needed to understand her inheritance. She still drew constantly, but now her sketches included detailed maps of mining claims, architectural plans for community development projects, and portraits of the extended family of friends and neighbors who had supported them through their trials. Tommy had grown into his role as big brother with remarkable maturity, developing the kind of protective instincts and natural leadership that reminded Jacob of his own military training. The boy who had pointed at a crying stranger and declared her his sister had become a young man who understood that family was both a gift and a responsibility. Jacob himself had discovered that returning to military service, even in a civilian capacity, hadn't required him to abandon the peaceful mountain life he'd built. Instead, it had allowed him to use his skills and experience to protect not just his own family, but the entire community that had become their extended home. The new family portrait sat in a place of honor on the mantel, a formal photograph taken in Denver to commemorate Jacob's appointment to territorial office. In it, Jacob wore his dress uniform for the first time in 15 years. Grace was dressed in a beautiful gown, purchased with her own money, and Tommy stood proudly between them in his first real suit. But it was the expressions on their faces that made the portrait special, the unmistakable look of people who belonged together completely. On this particular spring morning, Grace was teaching art lessons to several children from town, including Sarah Coleman and young Billy Henderson, whose life she had saved the previous winter. Her natural talent and formal education made her an excellent teacher, and Jacob had agreed to let her establish a small school for children whose parents wanted them to have opportunities beyond what the local schoolmaster could provide. Tommy was helping Jacob review mining reports and territorial correspondence, his quick mind proving surprisingly adept at understanding the complex legal and financial issues involved in managing Grace's inheritance. At 9 years old, he was already showing the kind of analytical intelligence that suggested he might follow his father into territorial administration or military service when he came of age. "Pa," Tommy said, looking up from a letter he'd been reading aloud. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if Grace would be willing to draw pictures for the new general store catalog." Jacob smiled at his son's casual assumption that such decisions were family matters to be discussed and decided together. "What do you think, Grace? Do you have time for commercial art projects?" Grace looked up from her lesson with paint-stained fingers and bright eyes. "I think it would be fun. And Mrs. Patterson has been so kind to us. I'd like to help her business succeed." It was exactly the kind of response Jacob had come to expect from Grace, generous, thoughtful, and practical in ways that suggested she would grow up to be not just wealthy, but wise in the use of her wealth. A knock at the door interrupted their morning routine. Jacob opened it to find Daniel Hawthorne standing on the porch, but his demeanor was entirely different from his first visit. The stern, officious lawyer had been replaced by a man who seemed genuinely pleased to be there. "Mr. Stone," Hawthorne said with a warm smile, "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I was in the area on territorial business and wanted to see how Grace is doing." "Of course," Jacob replied, stepping aside to welcome him in. "Grace, you have a visitor." Grace looked up from her art lesson with bright curiosity. Over the months since the legal resolution, Hawthorne had become something of a family friend, writing regularly with updates about her Boston family and handling the legal complexities of her inheritance with scrupulous honesty and care. "Mr. Hawthorne," Grace exclaimed, abandoning her painting to greet him properly. "Did you bring news from grandmother and grandfather?" "I did indeed," Hawthorne replied, pulling out a packet of letters and small packages. "They've sent photographs of the family estate, some books they thought you might enjoy, and a very special gift." Grace opened the largest package to reveal an elaborate artist's kit. Professional quality paints, brushes, and papers that represented the finest materials available. The accompanying letter, written in elegant script, expressed her grandmother's pride in Grace's artistic accomplishments and her hope that these supplies would help her continue developing her talents. "They want to come visit this summer," Hawthorne explained. "If that would be agreeable to everyone, of course. They're very eager to meet the family that has made Grace so happy." Jacob felt a moment of apprehension. Would wealthy Boston grandparents find their mountain life too rough, too simple, too far removed from the sophisticated world they were accustomed to? But Grace's delighted smile chased away any worries. "Oh, could they really come here? I have so much to show them. The mountains, and my drawings, and Tommy's slingshot skills, and the mine office, and our family," Tommy added with simple pride. "They should meet our real family." Jacob realized that Tommy was right. Over the months since Grace's legal battles had ended, they hadn't just survived as a family unit. They had expanded, drawing in Mrs. Patterson as an honorary grandmother, Sheriff Coleman as a trusted uncle, and even former opponents like Dr. Hayes and Father Santos as valued advisors and friends. Of Grace's inheritance hadn't isolated them from their community. It had given them the resources to strengthen community bonds and create opportunities for everyone around them. The frightened little girl, who had once tried to hide her wealth for fear of being rejected, had become the center of a network of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. "I think a visit from your grandparents would be wonderful," Jacob said. "This mountain has been good to our family. Maybe it will be good to them too." As Hawthorne prepared to leave, he pulled Jacob aside for a private conversation. "Jacob, I want you to know how grateful Grace's grandparents are for what you've done. When I first came here, I was convinced that removing Grace from your custody was the only way to protect her interests. I was wrong." He gestured toward Grace, who was showing her art students the new supplies while explaining techniques with patient enthusiasm. "She's not just safe and happy. She's thriving in ways that wouldn't have been possible in any other environment. You've given her something more valuable than all the money in the world. You've given her the confidence to be herself." Jacob watched his daughter, for that's what she truly was now, in every way that mattered, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he'd made the right choice, despite all the opposition and uncertainty they'd faced. Later that evening, as the last of the art students departed and the family gathered for supper, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with Tommy's innocent certainty that the crying girl on the store steps was destined to be his sister, and it had led them through legal battles, death threats, and challenges that had seemed impossible to overcome, but they had overcome them. Not through luck or accident, but through the simple refusal to give up on each other. Love had proven stronger than law, choice had triumphed over circumstance, and the family they had built through determination and faith had survived every test the world could devise. As they sat around their expanded table, Grace discussing her plans for summer art classes, Tommy describing his latest adventures in the mountains, Jacob sharing news from his territorial office, the conversation was interrupted by a familiar sound from outside. Another traveler was approaching up the mountain trail. But this time the sound brought no anxiety or fear. Their family was secure, their future was assured, and their home was strong enough to welcome whatever challenges or blessings might come their way. Grace looked up from her sketchbook, where she was drawing plans for the art school she hoped to establish, and smiled at Jacob with the radiant joy of someone who had found exactly where she belonged, "Pa," she said, using the title that still filled Jacob's heart with warmth every time he heard it. "Do you think someday other children might find families the way I found mine?" Jacob thought of all the abandoned children in the world, all the lonely adults who had love to give but no one to share it with, all the families that might be built through choice and courage rather than blood and convention. "I hope so, sweetheart," he said. "I truly hope so." Outside, spring continued its gentle transformation of the mountain landscape, and inside their warm cabin, the Stone family continued their own transformation from three separate souls who had found each other by chance into a permanent constellation of love that would guide them through whatever adventures lay ahead. The story that had begun with a child's pointing finger and a simple declaration, "That's going to be my sister," had become something larger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. It had become proof that sometimes the most important truths in life are spoken by the most innocent voices, and that families built on love and choice are the strongest foundations of all. In the growing darkness, their cabin glowed with warm light and the sound of laughter, a beacon of hope for anyone who might be traveling the difficult road toward home, family, and the kind of belonging that transforms not just individual lives, but entire communities. The Stone family had learned that love, when backed by courage and commitment, really could conquer all, and that lesson would echo through their lives and the lives of everyone they touched for generations to come.